Chapter 1322. Other than Ko Hua and her sister, after meeting the other 11 daughters of Ekis, Brando suddenly heard someone calling him from behind. He thought it was Huang Hua, but when he turned around he saw a long-haired girl with a ponytail. She was wearing a strange black armor, but the armor was gone, revealing a beautiful face. There was a beautiful silver mark on her forehead. Brando remembered that he had met this girl on the battlefield before. At that time, her companions called her Andrea. When the girl called Andrea saw that Brando had stopped, she quickly chased after him and shouted, "Sir Ancestor." "What? Ah, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Andrea. Sir, Andrea is a member of the Goddess of War Guards. The Goddess of War Guards belongs to a branch of the Earth Legion. However, our main opponent is not the Crystal Cluster, but the No race." Andrea replied like a machine gun. "Sir, in our memory, the ancestors have not appeared for 5 eras. I have never seen you before." No, I am too happy, so please forgive Andrea for being rude." No. Brando shook his head. "Andrea, there is nothing to be rude about. It's just that I don't quite understand what you are trying to say." "Sir, have you forgotten about us?" Andrea stared with her eyes wide open, looking incredulous. Brando also stared with his eyes wide open, wondering if he had said something wrong. "Know this?" Brando thought for a moment. "I have never heard of the Goddess of War Guards. I know about the Earth Legion, but aren't they no longer around?" "The Earth Legion is indeed no longer around, sir," Andrea replied with a little disappointment. "We lost all our comrades in the Battle of Sami Bay. In order to keep the Crystal Cluster army outside the elemental barrier, the commander let the Scorching Sun Fortress crash into the Crystal Cluster's hive. The remaining 3 Earth Legions battle order also perished together with the hive. But at least we managed to severely injure the Queen Bee, or we would not only see Leviathan's projection here today. Even if Luchaprak was one of the 3 leaders of the Chaos, Lady Fuchsia is really powerful. She only needed 1 hit to kill its clone." Brando listened to the girls' chatter and felt a little dizzy. For example, who was Queen Bee and what was Luchaprak? He had never heard of it before. Wait, Queen Bee? He suddenly widened his eyes and interrupted Andrea. Queen Bee? Andrea, who was interrupted, was stunned for a moment before she nodded at him. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air. He may not know who Luchaprak was, but he could not know Queen Bee. In fact, in the previous life, this name had another identity that left a deep impression in the players' minds. It was the ruler of the Great Hive, the Demon King Ovihin. Although it was called the Queen Bee, Ovihin did not have a gender. It was a pure amalgamation of consciousness, and its surface was made up of multidimensional crystals. Legend had it that it was originally a star, but it gave birth to intelligence in the chaos. It became extremely violent, and after devouring countless worlds, it became the Demon King of today. All the demons in Wonde were its disciples and disciples. It was the leader of the 3 leaders of the chaos. Players in the Amber Sword had only heard of its name, but had never seen it in person. After all, even the demon lords under its command were not easy to deal with. When Brando heard Andrea say that the Earth Legion could actually injure the Demon King, he could not help but feel a wave of shock. After all, this was the Earth Legion at the end of its flight. If it was at its peak, how strong would the Earth Legion be? And even with such a powerful force controlled by the World of Order, it could not defeat the Twilight Dragon. Brando stood there in a daze, his heart cold. "My lord." Andrea seemed to have noticed Brando's state and could not help but whisper. She frowned, still thinking about what she had said wrong. "No." Brando woke up and shook his head. "Please continue, Miss Andrea. Just call me Andrea, my lord. We don't call each other Miss or Mr. here. It sounds strange, but we all call each other that." Andrea flipped her small braids and replied. After the commander and the Crystal Cluster's nest perished together, the Earth Legion essentially existed in name only. The key is that after losing the Scorching Sun Fortress, we had to retreat to the elemental barrier and continue to resist the Crystal Cluster here. The Madara people and the heroic spirits have helped us a lot. If it were not for them, the will of the Twilight Dragon would have broken through the barrier long ago. What do you mean by the will of the Twilight Dragon breaking through the barrier? Brando realized that this little girl did not seem to realize the nature of the undead. and thus called them Madara people. This term made him feel a little awkward. I'm not too sure, my lord, but it has something to do with the Battle of the Azure Night. At that time the gods led the will of the Twilight Dragon into Woned and sealed it. After the Twilight Dragon was reborn from the chaos, the first thing it did was to find its sealed will. It let the crystal cluster invade Woned and attack Erwin because of this reason. This was another explanation, but it was similar to his own personal experience. Brando could not help but ask, why didn't it just let the Somir crystal fall into Erwin? That's the portal of the crystal cluster, right? It's better to say that it's their spaceship. It's not that it doesn't want to, but it can't. The will of Martha and the code of Tiamat shrouded Woned. Even the Twilight Dragon can't do whatever it wants. It may let some of the crystal cluster infiltrate Woned, but it's impossible to invade on such a large scale. Otherwise, how can the elemental barrier be called the boundary of order? Andrea answered logically. Brando was shocked by the word spaceship. He wondered if he was in a fantasy world or a science fiction world. But he suddenly remembered what happened to Dilfari and Yenbao and her brother. If he guessed correctly, this was the team that the crystal cluster infiltrated. Thinking of this, he became a little serious. He had seen the combat power of the crystal cluster, and it was definitely not something to be trifled with. The key was that the Somir crystal would assimilate the nearby creatures and plants. If someone who did not understand it accidentally entered the range and fought with the crystal cluster, he was afraid that they would suffer a great loss. He was not worried that the crystal cluster would do anything to Erwin, but he was worried that Princess Grafine and Dilfari would be at a disadvantage when they attacked the territory of Count Yenbao. Thinking of this, he could not help but think of returning to Erwin immediately. But there was another problem here. If Andrea did not lie to him, according to his experience in the elemental barrier, the Twilight Dragon, Roman, should have recovered its sealed will. Although it might have been resealed by Mistata and the other saints at the cost of their lives, in theory, the Twilight Dragon should have broken the barrier and entered the elemental barrier. He took a closer look at Andrea's expression, but she didn't seem to be aware of it. Brando did not know if he should tell them about this matter. While he was hesitating, Andrea had already continued to chatter. This war is very important. It was started by Luchaprak, and the intention is to expand the entrance of the crystal cluster into Woned. Because of the fall of the Black Moon a few weeks ago, there was a starfall in Woned, and the crystal cluster army took this opportunity to invade. We thought it would be a tough battle, but we did not expect that my lord would suddenly appear on the battlefield. Brando hurriedly interrupted the girl who spoke with a somewhat worshipful tone. What is Luchaprak? My lord, don't you know? It is one of the 3 leaders of the Twilight. I have heard you describe it just now, but why is it in the image of a leviathan? Because it is a leviathan. Luchaprak is a giant beast born in the chaos. It is the name of the most powerful leviathan. It is loyal to the Twilight, and is one of the most powerful warriors in the Chaos Army. I see. Brando nodded. He suddenly thought of something and asked, about the starfall a few weeks ago. Do you know what happened? He wanted to take the opportunity to ask Andrea and the others if they knew that the Twilight Dragon had broken through the wall, but he did not expect the latter's expression to become gloomy. 70 years ago, there was also a starfall in the south of Rosaline. At that time, because of the Battle of Sami Bay, Fort Scorching Sun self-disintegrated, and a crack appeared in the defense line of the elemental frontier. The Crystal Cluster Army was able to enter this world. In the past 70 years, our strength has been declining day by day, and we can no longer guarantee the integrity of the elemental barrier. I think the starfall a few weeks ago was because the Crystal Cluster Army had opened up the eastern battlefield. The eastern battlefield? Well, in the Great Glacier, we intercepted their intentions a long time ago, and the Bugas have been making arrangements for this. I think the elves of Atlanta and the Fanzin should have already gone to the battlefield. Brando did not expect Andrea to be so knowledgeable about the situation in Vaughn. He asked with some surprise. It turns out that the Bugas have set up so many surveillance points on the eastern border, not for the undead but for the crystal cluster? Andrea nodded. To be exact, it's for the invasion of the Twilight. But why didn't they tell the mortals about these things earlier? Brando was a little angry. The Silver Folk had always been a little high and mighty, but this was nothing in itself. It was just that they should not have kept the agreement with Odin hidden until today, and kept the mortal kingdom in the dark without mentioning a word. This may sound a little noble, but it was unfair to the thousands of Iron folk who were related to their own fate. Brando had never been a saint, but he believed that they, all the mortals in Wound who had no idea about their future, including himself, had the right to decide their own fate. Andrea was startled by his tone, and her face turned pale. Although she was a brave warrior, the people in front of her were her ancestors. How could she be indifferent? My lord, the mortals are too weak. Although we intend to guide their heroic spirits to join the Earth Legion and fight for the fate of the world, the kingdom of mortals must grow in a stable environment. They are too weak, like saplings in the garden, infants in swaddling clothes. Brando only then realized that his tone was a little harsh and hurriedly said, "I'm sorry, I'm not targeting you, Miss Andrea. It's nothing." Andrea hurriedly shook her head. Brendel furrowed his brows. He knew that Andrea was right. No one could be blamed for this. Compared to the power of dusk, the mortal kingdoms were too weak. Even now it was still the same. He pursed his lips and asked after a long while, "Are you also fighting in the Great Glacier?" "No," Andrea shook her head. "I'm not sure about the situation there. There used to be many warriors in Wound. Perhaps some of them have survived." Chapter 1323. While the two of them were talking, there was a sudden cheer from not far away. Brendel looked over and saw a large group of girls surrounding something. They were wearing armor similar to Andrea's, and were clearly members of the Goddess of War's guards. "Andrea, my lord, you came just in time." One of the round-faced girls turned around and saw the two of them. She was pleasantly surprised and quickly waved her hand. "Come and take a look at this." Brando was stunned. He pointed at himself and asked, "Are you calling me miss?" "Of course, my lord." Andrea smiled and nodded to her companions. At the same time she explained, "Although we are the 8th or even 9th generation and don't know much about the past, you have the highest authority in the system. This is without a doubt, so we should use honorifics to address you." 8th generation? 9th generation? Just like the Planeswalkers, the inheritance of the Goddess of War is passed down from generation to generation. "Sir, as you can see, we are not the natives of Vaunt. In fact, we belong to the Goddess of War Guard from the moment we were born. From the moment I opened my eyes, I began to accept all of its inheritance. We have many ancestors, but I have never seen them. I only know that they have fought in a previous era. In our memories, in our blood, there is also the will to fight of our ancestors." Because of the round-faced girl, the other goddesses of war noticed Brando. They turned around with different expressions. Some were curious, some were sizing him up, some were nervous, and some were excited. However, everyone fell silent. Brando and Andrea walked towards her companions. He wanted to know more about these goddesses of war. Wound did not have many records about the Earth Legion, and there was even less information about its internal structure. The round-faced girl bowed to Brando, and the other girls followed suit. Brando hurriedly returned the bow, but the girls seemed to be a little flustered. "Quiet, sisters." Brendel watched as Andrea calmly calmed her companions down. The girls were very disciplined, and they quieted down. Their eyes were fixed on Andrea's direction, and no one whispered to each other. Brendel was not used to being stared at like this. After all, there were so many curious gazes directed at him, and it was a little unbearable for him. He hurriedly asked, "What's the matter?" He quickly asked, "Andrea, if that's the case, who nurtured you? Was it the Earth Legion?" "No, my lord." Andrea shook her head. "It was Gaia's will. It was Mother who nurtured us. We were born in a place called Wartheim. According to the mortals, it is the kingdom of silver. There are rivers of gold and silver flowing in the cracks of the earth. The dwarfs hammered by the river, and sparks flew. There is a silver plain there, and there is a huge fortress called Mimir. That is our homeland." "Silver Plain." Brando was shocked. "Silver Plain is your homeland?" Wartheim was the country of dwarves and pygmies in Norse mythology. The Amber Sword used a lot of nouns and places in Norse mythology. In the Pale poem, a world tree ran through the beginning. It was the beginning of heaven and earth. On its crown, the kingdom of God, Asgard, was the brightest jewel on the crown. That was where Martha's throne was. There were two legends about Asgard. One was Martha's golden palace, and the other was the Valhalla Hall of Valhalla. This was the most sacred kingdom of Martha and the gods. Later, when the gods died, the kingdom of God disappeared. Later, the only connection between mortals and the kingdom of God, Babel Fortress, fell in the war. The information about the past withered in the wind, and there was not a word left. Later, the world tree cultivated by the elves and druids was just a symbol and a substitute. Although it was called the world tree, it was far inferior to the former. Brando's own Valhalla Fortress was also such a replica. Under Asgard was the Kingdom of Gold, the Glorious Plain, and Vanaheim, the homeland of the divine people. Legend said that the divine people created the gold and silver races here. That was how the Kingdom of Gold came about. But Vanaheim was completely destroyed in the Third War, and the divine people were left behind on the earth. This was the beginning of the Age of Mortals. Under Asgard and the Kingdom of Gold above the atrium there was a place called Alfheim. It was not located in the modern world, but in a place called the Holy Silver Valley. It was the country of the Silver Elves and the homeland of all elves. Legend said that after the elves died, their souls would return to this place. As for Alfheim, Medisha had spent her childhood there, but she rarely mentioned her homeland. Brando never asked about it, because he knew that the elves valued their homeland very much. They would rarely talk about it in front of outsiders. To them it was a kind of blasphemy. Finally, there was the atrium, which was the prime material realm of Wound in the modern world. It was the country of humans and giants. Before the Fifth War, Odin and the giant god Milos had once ruled this land. But with the defeat of Milos, the giants, a race that was once as famous as the dragons, gradually disappeared from history. Of course, there was the credit of Dusk, but there was also the credit of the Myrnas. The Myrnas' rule over the land was not a smooth process. The roots of the world tree went deep into the ground, first going into the endless abyss. This was the country of the goddesses Alice and Helene. There was nothing here, only a bottomless stream flowing quietly. That was the river of fate. The leaves of the world tree fell on the surface of the river, reflecting the face of the blind goddess Helene. The goddess had opened the card of fate in the abyss, revealing the fate of all living things. And under the endless abyss there was a deeper world, shrouded in fog and ice all year round. That was the country of Hell, the kingdom of the dead, the end of all souls and the dead. Legend said that there was a sea of broken ice, filled not with seawater, but the corpses of the entire world. The elements of death, the magic of death, the water, fire, ice, and wind of death, all of them were silent there. Between the countries of Helene and Helene, legend said that deep under the Jorgendi Ridge, there was a country of the dwarves above the scorching river of the fire kingdom of the demons. That was the Silver Plains, Wartheim, and also the homeland of the rune dwarf Odin. It was also very likely the homeland of the nun princess Magadol. But legend said that the Silver Plains was destroyed in a war because the venomous dragon Nidhogg bit off the roots of the world tree. Since then its location had become the world's greatest secret, and the dwarves had lost their homeland. In fact, Wound seemed to be intact on the surface, but the few worlds that were connected to it had already been destroyed. First, it was the divine kingdoms of Asgard and Vanaheim, then the Silver Plains, and now the elemental barrier had been completely destroyed. If not for that, the Twilight Dragon and its army would not have been able to invade this world so easily. Andrea nodded silently and replied with a little nostalgia. Yes, my lord. Our homeland is the place called the Silver Plains by the mortals. But in fact, the Silver Plains is only a corner of Wartheim. There are many wonders in that world, such as the river of lava, which is connected to the scorching hell. At the same time, that river is the starting point of Wound's time. It is the opposite of Helene's river of abyss, which is the end of Wound's time. But wasn't the Silver Plains destroyed because Nidhogg bit off the roots of the world tree? It was Wartheim that was destroyed, my lord, Andrea replied. After Wartheim was destroyed, the Silver Plains was lost in the void. Like many other world fragments, it is also a world fragment floating above the Sea of Chaos. But the river of lava has always maintained its connection to Wound. It passes through the home of the demons, the scorching hell, and the Jorgendi Ridge. So, the Silver Plains can still be found in Wound? Is the legend of the dwarves true? Brando asked. Andrea nodded. Although the chances are very slim, the dwarves have always been looking for their homeland. but the location of the River of Time in Wound is uncertain. It could reveal a part of Wartheim and Jorgendy Ridge at any time, but in the next moment it could disappear in an instant. Brando was silent for a moment. Andrea led him through the encirclement of the war goddesses. Brando seemed to be thinking about something and did not even realize it. He suddenly looked up and asked, "Andrea, have you heard of the name EU? It sounds familiar." Andrea frowned. "I remember now. Isn't that a long-range teleportation terminal?" "What?" "It's this thing." Andrea suddenly waved her hand and a beam of light came down from the dark night sky and landed on her hand that was covered with a layer of streamlined armor. She clenched her hand and the light condensed into a black spear. Only the tip of the spear was made of bright light. It was a light spear. "This is a raven, a light spear used by individual soldiers. It is very effective against the flying units of the crystal cluster." Andrea held the spear in front of Brando and explained to him, "But it is actually not a physical thing. This is a war weapon projected from the war dragon. It was sent here through the long-range teleportation terminal." "But my lord, the RT you mention may be a little different. The RT you mention may be the 17th factory in Mimir. That is the creator's delivery device. It is very different from the weapon projection of the war dragon. We don't know much about this, my lord." Brando was stunned. "What is the creator?" Chapter 1324. "It's a long story, my lord," Andrea replied. "But it just so happens that we want to show you something." As she spoke, she walked forward. At this time, a path suddenly opened in the middle of the war goddesses. Two girls who were dressed similarly to Andrea carried an item to the two of them. Under Andrea's instructions, they placed the item at Brando's feet. Brando saw that it was a black crystal about a cubic meter in size. It looked quite heavy, but the two war goddesses didn't seem to use much strength to put it down. Of course, Brando was not stupid enough to think that this thing was actually very light. When he fought with Leviathan, he saw that the combat power of these girls was not inferior to Wound, who was at the peak of the law. This did not include their strange equipment and abilities. Besides, as a part of the Earth Legion that fought against Dusk, even if they lost most of their inheritance, how weak could their true strength be? "What is this?" Brando asked. "This was found in the corpse of Luchaprak's projection. To be exact, it was found in its stomach, my lord." Brando raised his eyebrows in surprise. He did not expect the crystal to have a stomach. The structure of these crystal-like creatures was completely different from carbon-based creatures. He thought that they directly replenished their energy by devouring magic. If that was the case, they naturally did not need a digestive system. Andrea seemed to have seen through his thoughts and replied, "The crystal also need to eat. Although they do devour magic, they actually devour the foundation of the various worlds, including elements, matter, and energy. Their stomach is actually different from what we know. It's actually an independent space. I'm just making an analogy." Brando nodded and understood. When the venomous dragon Niord bit off the world tree's root, Luchaprak, one of the three leaders, invaded Wartheim together with him. The dwarves lost many divine artifacts, and even Haurangaya was damaged. Most of these divine artifacts were in Luchaprak's stomach. This thing was found in Luchaprak's stomach. In fact, every time we killed Luchaprak's doppelgangers, we would more or less gain something. In Wound, the poisonous dragon Niholt was actually the Ouroboros that All for One worshipped. In the Pale poem, it was called Ouroboros. The witches called it the creature of greed and despair. It was also a symbol of alchemy. It was not originally a creature of chaos, but a product of coexistence with the world tree. One represented hope, the other represented despair. However, the greedy giant snake eventually devoured itself. After it bit off the root of the world tree collapsed, destroying the gods in the Golden Age. Just like the snake, Leviathan was also a famous glutton. It swam in the void and devoured everything. The only difference between it and the snake was that it didn't eat itself. Luchaprak, as a member of Leviathan, was obviously no exception. "Then what is this?" Brando asked. He knew that Andrea would not speak without thinking. This thing she showed him must have something to do with the previous question. Andrea put down the spear and inserted the tip of the light spear into the black crystal. If we're not wrong, this should be that thing. With a few cracking sounds, a few spiderweb-like cracks suddenly appeared on the black crystal. Then more and more cracks appeared until the whole thing collapsed. With a crack like an eggshell cracking open, the thing inside was revealed. Brando saw that after the outer shell of the crystal cracked open, a silver-white metal piece was revealed. It looked familiar, but he could not recall where he had seen it before. However, he felt that it looked like a box. His guess was not wrong. When the piece of metal was exposed to the air, Andrea put away the spear in her hand and squatted down. She placed her hand on the piece of metal and said with some surprise, "A grade, it's even better than I thought." "What's grade A?" "It's a category of divine artifacts, my lord. However, it's not suitable for ordinary divine artifacts. To be precise, it's a category of the Creator's divine artifacts," Andrea replied with excitement. In fact, it was not just her. Almost all the goddess of war girls around them were surprised. Obviously, they had never seen such a high-grade item before. "My lord, your luck is really good," Andrea praised from the bottom of her heart. Brendel thought to himself, "I'm a little prince with a black face, and I'm practically a match made in heaven with Senior. Since when did I get praised for being lucky? Could it be that there's some unknown change in the world line?" He hurriedly asked, "What's a Creator's divine artifact?" Andrea patted the metal cube lightly, and it suddenly began to twist. It was as if its metal outer layer had suddenly turned into a ball of liquid that flowed in all directions. Finally, it shrunk into a ball, revealing the thing underneath. "It's actually this thing." When Brando saw it, he could not help but cry out, "Huh!" Andrea was surprised. "My lord, do you recognize it?" Brando took a deep breath and replied, "The Book of Gaia." "Ah yes, this is indeed the Book of Gaia," Andrea hurriedly replied. "This is one of the best among the great divine artifacts. Our luck is really good, but unfortunately..." "Right, my lord, do you know the use of this divine artifact?" Brando silently nodded. This Book of Gaia was also known as the Holy Book of Earth in the past life. This was the most sacred artifact of an elementalist. As long as you had it, you would automatically learn all earth elemental magic. No matter if it was lost in the past or created by someone else in this era, as long as it existed in this world, it would be recorded in this book and integrated into the memory of the holder. Even if the holder was only an elementalist apprentice, they would be able to use this book to cast a 14th circle earth elemental forbidden spell. As long as the holder had enough willpower and mana pool. But this book only had one flaw, and that was that it was not a pure magic book, nor was it a pure magic equipment. To be precise, this thing was a war machine, just like large-scale war machines such as magic cannons, floating battleships, and messaging crystals. It could not be controlled by a single person, and it needed a powerful magic core to support its use. Generally speaking, people would place this book in a magic tower or a floating battleship as a defensive or offensive weapon. But even so, ordinary magic towers and floating battleships would not be able to support its power. Only the most powerful mage towers and first-class battleships would be able to contain this sacred artifact. But even so, in the future, this book was one of the most famous divine artifacts. Any guild that had it could become one of the top guilds in the Amber Sword. Think about it, this book was equivalent to a guild directly having a top elementalist that was almost equal to the level of a sage. And as long as there were enough mana potions, this mage could almost infinitely cast terrifying spells above the 10th circle with the support of a battleship or a magic tower. In fact, this was something that even a real elementalist would have a hard time doing. Brando remembered that this book was obtained by Diamond Force in his era. The reason why Diamond Force was known as one of the top 3 guilds in Wone was largely because of this book. And at this moment, this book was lying quietly in front of him. Andrea saw Brando nodding, then continued, "The Book of Gaia, the Book of Ocean, the Book of Flame, and the Book of Air. These 4 elemental books are also known as the Book of Revelation. There are many records about them in the mortal world. Many elementalists regard them as their lifelong pursuit. But in fact, these are not sacred artifacts for mortals. They were originally designed to exist as auxiliary weapons for the creators, so in fact, mortals can't use them very well. Unfortunately," she sighed and said, "in the battle where the gods left the world, Factory number 17 was completely destroyed by Luchaprak. The 12 creators created by the ancestors all died in the battle. In this world, no one can truly use these sacred artifacts anymore." The war goddesses all had expressions of regret on their faces. However, they weren't regretting the fate of these holy items. Instead, they were regretting the fact that their powerful companions in the past had all left this world. They were the only ones left who were still fighting alone. Perhaps at some point in time this final spark of hope would be extinguished. Brando swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He suddenly asked dryly, "What exactly is a creator, Andrea?" "My lord, you should know about the origin of the golden race, right?" Brando nodded. The generation with the golden blood flowing in their veins are the warriors of the gods. They are the masterpieces of the divine people. But before the divine people, the first generation of divine people, in other words, the ancestors had already been creating warriors. Together with Martha, they first created 14,000 gods, then countless secondary gods, demigods, but below the demigods, they also created divine servants. This is the origin of the creators. The creators from the very beginning were the people who created the world. They were the ancestors of the Matatanians, and also the prototype of the Planeswalker law. In fact, the Planeswalker system itself was a mature product after the failure of the creator's plan. Although there was a follow-up plan, and Milos and the Giants were the beneficiaries of this follow-up plan, but in the end, the gods replaced the Titans with the more mature Planeswalker system and the Golden Race. But the creators were still preserved as the strongest force. Until the battle where the gods left the world, a total of 12 of them were born, Andrea said. They are the 12 children of Mother Gaia, the 12 Titans Cronus, Rhea, Oceanus, Thetis, Zupilion, Mordaunt, Iapetus, Cleos, Themis, Phoebe and Kos. Although there was a 13th creator, the omnipotent creator, Eve, but unfortunately, after the destruction of Factory Number 17, everything became a mystery, and this 13th creator never appeared again. Brando's heart pounded at this time, and he asked with a trembling voice, "Andrea, you mean you? Is Factory Number 17? At least part of the long-range teleportation terminal, my lord. There are only 12 creators? Or 13? Andrea nodded. I have a question, for example, Brando asked carefully. For example, if there are still creators alive, what form should they be in? Andrea thought for a moment and shook her head. I don't know, my lord. I have never seen them, but they are very likely to be very different from us. As far as I know, they are the same as the first generation of gods. They are not real creatures, but creatures driven by the spark of God. Every creator has a powerful spark of God. Spark of God. P.S. There is a new moderator in the book review section, OTL. I only recently found out how Chidian's new system manages the book review section. When I went through it the other day, I found out that there were several applications, but I didn't know. It felt like an avalanche. Chapter 1325. Year 376 of the First Era. At the end of the Year of the Sword, everything withered and winter came. After a long time we will remember what happened in this month. Opsum in north of the Evergreen Corridor, a small town east of Metz. Along the frost-stained mountain road near the town, people were retreating with their heads down. A few long lines were winding through the forest in the early winter. People stepped on the shallow layer of snow and creaking broken branches in silence. Rows of knights walked past. Their bright armor was stained with dirty blood. Their spears were full of holes, and their flags were drooping with holes of all sizes. Duke Odwig's face was covered with dust. His hands were bent like chicken feet, and he could not stop trembling. His exposed fingers were covered with blue and red frostbites. He could only subconsciously grab the reins of his horse. He looked at the scene in a daze, as if he had not woken up from that nightmare. Of course he would rather not wake up, so that he would forever be immersed in that dream. Let time freeze at the moment when the crew's knight charged. It would be better if he never woke up. A few dragons flew to the south in a panic. When they swept past the hills, they brought a gust of icy wind, causing the pine trees to rustle. The people who were like walking corpses looked up and looked at the scene with blank eyes, but no one complained. The eldest prince of the crew's kingdom sat on his saddle, motionless like a puppet. His dark eyes kept changing colors, as if he was still reenacting the horrible scene that he saw that day. The figure that flew across the sky was slowly falling. The hero of the dragons, the dragon king of this generation. Odwig's lifeless body fell heavily to the ground. The dragons wailed and shrieked. Their mutilated corpses fell like raindrops. A huge black hole floated in the middle of the sky. Terrifying and ferocious creatures emerged from behind the black hole. They were its past masters who had left this world for countless years. They were the giant god Milos and the dragon god Bahamut. They had returned to destroy their own people with their own hands. On the ground, the complete defense line retreated bit by bit and completely collapsed. Many people knelt on the ground in despair, crying, praying, begging, hoping that Martha could save them. But they did not get a response. There was only endless darkness, pain, and slaughter. The will of dusk swept across the entire battlefield and looked at all of this coldly. Then it silently looked away. Thousands of worlds were destroyed, but in its eyes it was just a moment. The empire was finished. This mortal kingdom that had been established for more than 1,500 years had a glorious past and a long history. Its magnificent palace was engraved with words, murals, and carvings about the past of glory. Under the continuous heavy blows, it was like a proud knight. He was severely injured, his helmet cracked, his sword broken, and his blood stained the battlefield. But he still held his head high and stared at his enemies with a determined gaze. While the Tamil poets used their emotional and impassioned elegy, he breathed his last breath. His fall was destined to completely rewrite the history of the entire continent. However, the people who were trapped in the harsh winter and quagmire for a year were unable to spread the news immediately. The wilderness of the Four Realms and Anzaruta were separated by the calamity of the Black Moon's fall. In large areas of no man's land, the elves tried their best to salvage the losses caused by the calamity at the border. They didn't know that time was passing by in silence. By the time the first messenger in ragged clothes passed through the newly born Black Forest near the crack of the Evergreen Corridor and arrived in front of the deputy commander of the Red Army, in just Hillund, 2 crucial months had already been lost. By the time the humans and elves re-established their trust, they still didn't understand what kind of important thing they had lost. Time. Time that changed everything. A month later, a letter from the Cloak Bay was sent to the Black Sword Fortress. There was only a short line of words on the letter. Help, no matter who it is, no matter where you are, help us. We are finished. The fleet, we can't stop them. The signature on the letter was concise and powerful. Chris Goldshield, Earl Goldshield. The pride of the nobles of the Cloak Bay, the uncle of the Silver Queen, the husband of Princess Valerie, the high-spirited and famous admiral of the Imperial Navy, revealed a kind of gray and withered despair between the lines of this letter, as if it was the last words of a dying man. He used his own seal at the end of the letter as if it was stained with blood. The red mark seemed to indicate an ominous bloody future. Freya rode a horse and stood on a hill near Winomar, watching the army of the undead that was retreating from the lakeside area below. The first snow of Erewhon had yet to fall, and the wilderness was still bleak in the autumn evening. Bare branches grew in clumps, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves. The tall gray Karsuk horse stood in a patch of heather, carrying its master on its back and constantly swinging its tail to drive away insects. Behind the horse, the soldiers looked at their commander with admiration, and some of the young knights even had adoration in their eyes. Just 2 months ago, with the help of the counterattack of the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, Erewhon attacked Latios from both the left and right flanks at the same time, thus winning the first great victory since the Second War of the Black Rose. In that battle, Freya led the Valkyries and decisively cut into the junction between the 2 undead legions. She took the lead in the battle, shouting the name of Erewhon on the battlefield, like a flag that led everyone to advance. She also led the White Lion Guards, whose morale was high, to defeat Madara's Black Knight Regiment head-on, completely sealing the victory. In this battle, 2 of Latios' deputies died in the battle, and he himself was seriously injured. The Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, betrayed him, and the other commander, Skeletal Lord Rothman, also died in the hands of the Valkyries. After this battle, the army of the undead in Winomar, which was divided into 2, was unable to fight again. They were almost blocked by the allied forces of Ranner and Anthony at the lakeside area, and were no longer able to threaten Ranner and Anthony. The name of the Valkyrie on the battlefield spread like wildfire. After this battle, the Knight of the White Lion Guards almost spontaneously painted the emblem of 3 pairs of wings of light on their shields, as if to commemorate the shining flag they saw on the battlefield that day. The glittering wings of light were always right in front of everyone, never stopping. Under the hills, The undead were majestically converging towards the direction of Bragg's in the south. It was like a dark sea with flags of various colors mixed in it. There was no order, and it seemed a little disorderly. However, Freya's face did not have much joy. Her gaze was a little heavy. In the past half a month, ever since she received Brando's letter, she knew that the Second War of the Black Roses had come to an end. This was not bad news for Erwin. Although they had achieved a decisive victory in the battle in Winomar, the Highland Knight on Bragg's side, in Karsuk and Viro, were losing ground. Unlike the blind optimism of many people in this short year, especially the experience of serving as the Knight of Princess Griffine's side, Freya quickly transformed from the somewhat naive little girl from the countryside of Bucci to a qualified commander. Although she was perhaps still a step away from being a politician, at least it was enough for her to see some things that were more profound than what ordinary people could see, the factors that would determine Erwin's future. She stood silently on the hills, feeling her growth. It was as if she could finally feel Brando's gaze, everything he had seen in the past, and breathe the fate of the future with him. But everything that used to be simple and clear had now become complicated. Erwin was a small kingdom, but it had a powerful enemy. What it needed was not a trivial victory or revenge, but time and change. Peace was too precious for this country. It was so precious that it was almost unbearable. But the goddess of war was really worried about Brando. The letter mentioned the reason why His Majesty the Emperor of Madara and Erwin had reached an agreement. Madara's invasion of Erwin was due to a long-standing misunderstanding and mutual distrust between the two sides. Hatred had blinded the eyes of both the living and the dead. Under the instigation of some northern lords with bad intentions, it led to such a tragedy. Now that His Majesty the Emperor of Madara had made up his mind to pacify these northern rebels, he needed to call back the army to suppress the country. And the Black Rose of the Roman Empire in Erwin, a small kingdom in a corner of the country, should put aside their disputes. There was no natural conflict between large and small countries. Madara still had many enemies, but Erwin was not one of them. Not only that, as the natural enemy of the northern lords, Erwin should also support His Majesty the Emperor of Madara and form an alliance with him. This was a suggestion to Princess Griffine, and her student, the future king of Erwin, Haruz. It was such a letter. It removed the dark clouds of war that loomed over the ancient kingdom. But Freya knew in her heart that it would soon cause an uproar on another battlefield in the kingdom. From Viro to Lantinilan, from Silman to Radnor, the royal faction had already taken action. It wasn't just the nobles. In fact, she had heard a lot of complaints over the past few days. The knights were complaining that their lord had robbed them of their glory. They should have wiped out Manowar's undead army in one fell swoop. Oh! Chapter 1326. In fact, in the army, other than the loyal White Lion Guards, Anthony's allied army, and the noble army from the north were all saying the same thing. Think about it, the hatred in Bucci, the bloodshed in the First War of the Black Rose, how could it be so easily erased? Erwin's people needed revenge. Now that they were in front of the goddess of victory, they had no choice but to stop because of a letter and even form an alliance with their former enemy. How ridiculous was that? Freya was disgusted by such words. Where was the victory? Erwin was like a quagmire of despair. Manowar's partial advantage could not change the final result. Even this slight advantage was obtained by chance. Although everyone here called her the goddess of war, Freya's heart was clear and rational. She knew very well the reason why she won. It was not because of her personal bravery, nor was it because of her keen senses on the battlefield. It was not because of her excellent commanding ability, nor was it because of her unwavering belief in victory. The only thing that decided the outcome of the battle was Yalvit's betrayal. But the fanatical people often did not see this point. It was a pity that not every undead lord was Brunhilde's former companion. The case of the Queen of Banshees could not be more coincidental. The reason why it was called a coincidence was because it could not be repeated again and again. Erwin would not be so lucky every time. And when people were superstitious about this, they would suffer. But a mistake might not be a big deal to an opponent like Madara. But this small kingdom could be doomed eternally. Freya did not understand what the royal faction was planning, but the only thing she could be thankful for was that the war ended before all of this happened. Erwin might have pushed this fatal mistake further into the future, hoping that at that time, it would be strong enough to bear the consequences of its own actions. But now, the spearhead had moved away from Madara and was pointed at someone else. Someone she was familiar with, respected, and loved. Let's go, there's nothing to see. She took one last look at the scene below the hill, turned around and said to the others. The knights put away their weapons one by one. They knew what the lady was worried about. Most of them were actually young people from Tanajul. These young people's families used to stand on the opposite side of the new power, but now most of them benefited from it. And because of Princess Griffine, they were firmly tied to Brando's war chariot. Many of them had experienced the Battle of Silverman, and some had even experienced the early Battle of Menta and the Battle of Ampere Seal. They were the second sons of their families, and had joined the White Lion Guards with the mentality of being hostages. They had joined Brando's army, but what they received was far beyond their imagination. Now they were knights, the sharp blade of the kingdom. They had real noble titles, land and retainers. All of this was because of Tanajul's change. Whether it was to protect the honor of knights or their own interests, they were the most loyal followers of Brando and the White Lion Guards. More importantly, many of them understood that Her Royal Highness was also on their side. Therefore, although the glory of the 2 months of consecutive victories had come to an abrupt end, few of them had any complaints about their lord. On the contrary, they were full of resentment towards the rumors outside. Lord Commander, those country bumpkins don't understand how much the Count has sacrificed for Erewhon. Don't be angry about that nonsense. Where were they during the Battle of Ampere Seal? Where were they during the Battle of Silverman? They're just a bunch of worms who reap without sowing. When the Count returns to Erewhon, it'll be their turn to suffer. That's right. Those rumors outside were deliberately spread by those clowns from the royal faction. Otherwise, how many people would know about the contents of the letter? If the Count hadn't persuaded His Majesty the Emperor of Madara, who knows how long this war would have lasted? There's no such thing as a bloodless war in this world. It's just that the blood doesn't flow to those high and mighty lords. Naturally, they wouldn't feel any pain or itch. That's right. During the First War of the Black Rose, the population of the area around Bragg's decreased by 30%. All kinds of taxes were directly reduced by more than 70%. Karsuk was even worse. The Gold City area was almost turned into a wilderness. Now, the war has only been going on for less than 3 months, and the area from Manowar to Fort Kirkle is completely paralyzed. Look, why are only Duke Grinwar's and Duke Karsuk supporting the ceasefire? It's because the other people's knives didn't cut them, so naturally, they wouldn't feel any pain or itch. The knights chimed in one after another. Someone shook his head and said, "Isn't there still the Lantern Islands?" That knight of the Lantern Islands is a hardcore supporter of our Count. That's not the same. At the mention of Lantern Island's Knight Yak, everyone couldn't help but cheer up. This old-fashioned knight was said to have infuriated the royal faction recently. As the royal faction's main camp, the future Duke of Lantern Island had always stood firmly on the side of the princess and Count Tanajul. To Makarov and the others, this was more disgusting than eating a fly in a bowl of porridge. Freya looked at her knight and felt a little better. But she shook her head and said, "Let's not talk about this, knights. We only have one mission, and that is to fight and win. The Count will take care of everything. Besides, the royal faction is not our enemy." The knights shrugged their shoulders and looked at each other. They knew what their commander was trying to say. The royal faction was already attacking the Count for being disgraced and unruly. She just didn't want to leave more evidence in front of the princess. After all, everyone knew who the White Lion Guards and her, the goddess of war, represented. However, the young knights scoffed at this. In their eyes, their commander was a little too selfless. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that she had feelings for the Count. However, everyone knew that between the kingdom and the Lord, she could only choose one. Although the knight talked and laughed on the surface, they didn't completely agree with her. Most of them were nobles from Tanajul, and their way of looking at things was very different from Brando, who had experienced 2 lifetimes. They were also not idealists like Erewhon's goddess of war. Of course, most of the young Erewhon were extremely loyal to the White Lion Guards. It wasn't a problem for outsiders to call them the Princess Knight, but that was only when Griffine and Brando were on the same side. Who could represent Erewhon? That was a problem. But to these young knights, it wasn't a problem. To them, whoever brought glory to Erewhon could represent Erewhon. The battle between the central and local governments had never stopped since the birth of the kingdom. Wasn't the disagreement between the royal faction and the princess because of this? The thing that troubled Freya was normal to these knights. They even knew that Princess Griffine would definitely stand on the count's side. There was no problem at all. But even if they knew, no one would say it out loud. Freya wasn't a noble, and naturally didn't understand the rules of the game. But to these young knights, this knowledge was innate. They turned their horses around and prepared to leave. But at this moment, the bushes behind them suddenly parted, revealing a few knights. The knight was shocked and instinctively wanted to draw their weapons, but Freya reached out and stopped them. The person who came was Brunhilde. She was the head of Brando's Valkyrie knight. But behind her, there was an unfamiliar female knight. She was also riding on a wind-riding colt. She was tall and slender, with beautiful flaming long hair. Her aura was very different from the other Valkyries who were brave and fearless. She gave people a strange feeling of calmness and quietness. Freya knew the woman's identity the moment she saw her. Yalvit, the Queen of Banshees. She was one of the 3 most famous Valkyries in history. She was Brunhilde's assistant and also the brains of these Valkyrie sisters. After the destruction of Valhalla, she exiled herself to Madara and became an undead lord as a heroic spirit. Freya only knew about this history recently. Miss Brunhilde, is there anything I can help you with? Freya looked at the Queen of Banshees and asked. Brunhilde shook her head, but Yalvit, who was behind her, stood out and smiled. The one who is looking for you is me, Miss Freya. I just received a personal order from His Majesty. Mr. Brando asked me to bring you to see him. Miss Yalvit, what did you say? In front of Brando was a long corridor paved with obsidian. Its arched roof was very high, and 17 pillars formed an open space. On both sides of the corridor, there were dark rose windows with broken glass inlaid with legends and stories about the past. But those were not the glorious scrolls of the Golden Flame Holy Temple that were about the legendary battles between the previous kings and the mortals. Instead, they were some obscure, depressing, and even dark legends. He took 2 steps forward and raised his head to look at this holy temple that had existed for thousands of years. The most sacred place of the Roman Black Rose. Holy Temple of the Dying Moon. P.S. I accidentally caught a cold. I originally wanted to rest, but after thinking about it, I insisted on writing 2 chapters. The weather is cold, everyone take care of your health. Chapter 1327. In the middle of the gloomy hall stood a majestic statue of a goddess. The goddess wore a linen robe and held a fir staff in one hand. Her other hand hung naturally by her side, and a giant spider crawled at her feet. This was the image of the goddess of the dead moon, Kelwesis. Legend has it that Kleis was one of the many incarnations of Martha in the mortal world. So the undead often believed that they worshipped Martha. The atmosphere in the temple was somewhat solemn. Under the arches, many acolytes in black robes were prostrating, softly chanting scriptures in praise of Kleis. The chanting of scriptures from far and near gathered together, echoing in the hall. Brando looked at this scene with a solemn expression. The sound of footsteps came from behind him. Andrea was not far behind him, just a few steps behind. She looked around the hall and asked a question that was unrelated to the hall. Why did the Queen of Madara suddenly summon us? Brando shook his head silently. How would he know? Maybe it was a whim, or maybe it was because there was substantial progress in the negotiations between Delphian and the former, or maybe there was a reply from the envoy sent to Erewhon, or maybe it was because of some other reason. Delphian's negotiations had come to an end a week ago. There was a thick stack of agreements and secret agreements signed in all aspects. Generally speaking, the clauses were beneficial to Erewhon, including the undead's unconditional end to the invasion and the return of Butchie. The Prime Minister's daughter had done a good job, and could be said to be perfect. He knew that some of his decisions might cause some people in Erewhon to dislike him, or even harm the interests of others, but this was not a big deal. These clauses could shut anyone up. Unless those people thought that he had the ability to take back Butchie. This was only the agreement on the surface. In private, Brando's request was very simple. During the War of the Black Rose, including the undead lords who participated in the massacre of Erewhon's citizens before the war, they had to be punished. Regarding this point, he did not intend to compromise from the beginning. If repaying Butchie was Erewhon's bottom line, then this was his bottom line. But what he did not expect was that he and the Prime Minister's daughter thought that the negotiations would fall into a difficult negotiation. They were even prepared to face a stalemate, but the Queen of Madara was surprisingly ruthless. She abandoned almost everyone on the list, leaving only a few undead lords that Brando and Delphian had used for bargaining. These undead lords' crimes were relatively light, or rather, their crimes were based on false rumors. Even the Lord of the Black Plague, who was loyal to her, was mercilessly abandoned by her. Such ruthlessness shocked Brando and Delphian. The Queen of Madara's behavior was somewhat unusual. She seemed to be too accommodating and obedient to the negotiations. For a long time after that, Brendel and Delphian thought that the Queen was up to something. But after half a month of being cautious, Erwin sent news that the Second War of the Black Rose had ended, and the undead had withdrawn from Erwin as promised. It was under such circumstances that he was summoned by the Queen. In the past few months many things had happened. The undead had clashed with the Crystal Cluster a few times in the south of the Sea of the Dead Moon, but not every time was as lucky as the battle at Finhotos. Although the Roman Black Rose had stabilized their position at Finhotos, overall, the undead were steadily losing and retreating in the south. Fortunately, Madara's territory was vast. Even if the Empire lost large areas of land in the south, it was not a big deal to the Empire, not to mention that most of the vast land was not under the rule of the Mercury Staff. After that, they returned to the land of Everdeath with the Queen of Madara. Overall, the central area of the Empire of the Dead Moon was still stable, and was not greatly affected by the upheaval of the Empire. On one hand, it was because very little news had spread out, but on the other hand, the upheaval was not a big deal to Madara. After all, it was year 376 of the First Age, not 60 years later, and not the middle of the Second Age. In this era, the Mercury Staff only ruled the land of Everdeath, the central area of the Sea of the Dead Moon, and some of the prosperous areas bordering Erewhon. The Queen claimed that the undead of the north and the east and the liches of Balakirevo were the enemies of the Empire. Was that not a normal thing? The undead living here thought that the Empire was just blowing the horn of war against the north and the east. From this point, Brando had seen the Queen's brilliant tactics. Of course, Delphian, who had clearly seen this on the battlefield and proposed this condition, was naturally classified as the same type of person as the Queen, a woman who was not to be trifled with. This type of people included the Wind Empress, the Silver Queen, Constance, his mother, Amandina, Medicia, and the little Roman who gave him a headache. By the way, Medicia was only added recently. But the surface stability was only for the lower class. For the upper class undead nobles who were directly related to the upheaval, it was impossible for them not to know the inside story. Under the surface of the land of Everdeath, there was a turbulent undercurrent brewing. The undead lords who were abandoned by the Queen, and the dark nobles who were unwilling to give up the benefits in their hands, naturally would not give up so easily. In the short span of 1 or 2 months, the Queen of Madara had already clashed with the forces represented by these vested interests many times. But every time it ended with the Queen's easy victory. Within 2 months, the corpses of 4 high and mighty undead lords were thrown on the central square of the seat of Everdeath, and another escaped to the ranks of the undead. From the beginning to the end she was not fighting alone. Insursta, Tarkus, and the families behind them stood firmly by the Queen's side. With Delphian's analysis and guidance, Brando quickly found a clear thread. He discovered that the Queen was borrowing the power of the new nobles to suppress the old undead lords. These people were abandoned by her one by one in history, crushed by the wheels of history. And now she was only speeding up the process. After understanding this, he was a little speechless. The undead army that he eliminated on the battlefield had now provided the Queen with room to play. If not for the unsolved mystery of the Mercury Staff that day, Brando almost thought that he had fallen into the Queen's scheme from the beginning to the end. After that, he spent a few days repeatedly reading the several centimeters thick War of the Black Rose memorandum, to make sure that there were no loopholes or traps in the clauses. Although Delphian was a little disdainful of his actions, the Prime Minister's daughter still patiently helped him complete the work. Then there was the Earth Legion. Looking at the burden behind him, he knew that the Earth Legion had not gone far since the Battle of Finhotos. In fact, they probably had no place to go. The elemental barrier had collapsed, and the defense line outside the territory had become fragmented. It was no different from a dream to expect to resist the invasion of the twilight outside Wonde. Since Andrea had mentioned that Fanzin and the wild elves of Atlanta had joined the battle, it meant that they had already planned to move to Wonde to continue the battle. In fact, the Silver Elves and the Goddess of War Guards had stayed behind. Only the army of the Lost Names was missing. According to the Chattering Girls, these ancient heroic spirits were the last descendants of the Earth Legion. They were the most precious wealth left to Wonde by the first generation of Odin, the Azure Knight. He signed a contract with the ancient kings so that their heroic spirits would forever stay in Wonde to protect their home and homeland. Legend had it that after the heroes of the Gold and Silver race died, their souls would return to the Valhalla's Temple of Valhalla and continue to fight for the gods. But after the Valhalla was lost with the Divine Kingdom, these heroic spirits became part of the Lost Names. They abandoned everything, their names, identities, and memories of the past, leaving only the will to fight and protect. The seven-pole dragon queen, Fuchsia, stayed behind to teach Medisha and Hippamera how to become real planeswalkers. Although the latter two were just planeswalkers, the evil dragon queen from the era when the Myrnas ruled the land said that there was no difference. There were still many things to learn, but her time was limited. She told Brando that she planned to bring Medisha and Hippamera to a place, the Radiant Sacred Pool, the sacred land of the Matatanians, the Planeswalkers' arena. Although it had been abandoned for a long time, there were still many laws left in the void. If Medisha and Hippamera wanted to quickly mature and become real Planeswalkers, it might be the best place. Brando had some doubts because Tumen did not mention this place to him that day. Fuchsia's arrogant personality naturally did not bother to explain it to him. She only said, "Do whatever you want," and left him to worry about it. She did not need to ask for the opinions of Medisha and Hippamera. In her opinion, Planeswalkers did not need to ask for the opinions of Planeswalkers. As long as Brando allowed it, that was enough. Brando had his reservations, but he was still very curious about this Planeswalker dragon from the ancient era. First of all, he knew that Planeswalkers were all divine people. Was Fuchsia one of them? If she was, then it would be interesting. That meant that divine people was not just a name for a race, but an existence that represented power and authority. Oh, Chapter 1328. But Fuchsia's answer dispelled his thoughts. The evil dragon told him with disdain that his planeswalker authority came from the divine people of the later generations. This was actually a sign of the decline of the planeswalkers in the Truth Symposium. The planeswalkers' authority was bestowed upon them and not innate. In the era of the Myrnas, most of the planeswalkers' inheritances came from here. For example, Odin, Kelsey, and Tumen were not pure-blooded divine people. And it was precisely because of this reason that planeswalkers had declined from generation to generation, because in fact, the existence of this great profession in Vaunt had already lost its foundation. Although it was struggling at death's door, as long as the divine people did not return to this world, then one day this name would completely become history in Vaunt, just like what he saw in the game. In the end, the Seven Dragon King also told Brando the name of his deck. He told Brando that in his era, the 5-color deck represented Return to Ring, which was the most popular deck. Just like Tumen's Return to One, his deck was also a multicolor deck named 5 Colors of Dawn. Brando seemed to have fallen into a long silence. Andrea, who was behind him, also did not say a word. This young girl who grew up outside the elemental boundary and had almost never lived in Wonde was very unique. She knew a lot about Wonde's country, politics, history, geography, and even natural history. She knew a lot of ancient knowledge and knew all the versions of the Pale Epic. She was not much worse than the knowledgeable Buga Tower Guardians. However, she knew very little in certain aspects. She liked to talk, and once she opened her mouth she could not stop. However, she was not good at talking. She chattered a lot, but there was very little useful content. It was as if she only talked for the sake of talking, but most of the time she closed her mouth tightly and tried to think of the next topic. Brando did not know what kind of environment created such a character, but from Andrea and the others' descriptions, he understood the life of the guards of the goddess of war. They were born in war and died in war. Their understanding of this world was as if there was only endless war. The 3-month stay in Madara was a very special experience for each of them. The two of them maintained their silence as they walked between the 7th and 8th arched pillars. These arched pillars were all carved from the bones of giant beasts. They stood tall on the obsidian floor. The pale bones were covered with all kinds of strange sculptures. On the pedestal were circles of skulls. Some belonged to humans and some belonged to other monsters. The largest one was a dragon's head. There were a total of 17 arched pillars here, and 17 skeletal dragon corpses were pressed under the arched pillars. The humming of the acolytes surrounded the pillars, which were so thick that it would take more than a dozen people to wrap their arms around them. The ferocious sculptures on the pillars lingered on the arched ceiling of the hall. This surprised Brando. He did not expect the followers of the Dead Moon to be so devout. This was because he had not seen such a scene in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral of Wind, or anywhere else. Even in the morning and evening prayers of the Leo Palace, it was rare to see such a look of reverence on the faces of the priests and priests. Brando could easily see that it was reverence, a deep fear and worship of the mysterious existence. In the era of the gods, such reverence was understandable. But after the gods left, it had been many years since such an expression appeared on people's faces. The atmosphere in the hall was a little oppressive. He did not know if this was the atmosphere unique to the place of the undead, or the solemn mood of the acolytes. But as he walked forward, Brando's mood began to become a little heavy. "Have you met Princess Magadol?" He had to take the initiative to find a topic to ease the tension. He knew that if he did not speak, Andrea's question might be the only conversation they had on this journey. After familiarizing herself with his personality, Andrea always seemed to be particularly restrained in front of him. Andrea nodded excitedly. "That princess must be a creator. Although I don't know if she is the legendary Eve, she should be an all-round creator. This can't be wrong. Our organization may be different, but we are still somewhat familiar with the creation of Gaia's will." Brando knew that the creators were divided into two types. One was a warrior and the other was a wizard. Just like the two main classes in Wond, although there was also the ranger, nightingale, and magic swordsman. In essence, Wond only had two main classes, magic and physics. The rest were just branches of these two main classes. Among the 12 titans, 8 were warriors and 4 were wizards. Wizards were much rarer and more precious, and those auxiliary divine weapons were specially made for them. Warriors, on the other hand, usually wore armor and wielded great swords. They relied on their own combat experience and physical strength to fight. But in order to create a more perfect creator, Gaia created the all-round 13th person. According to Andrea, Magadol's strength and magic level may be far inferior to the warrior and wizard type creators, but being all-round meant that there were no obvious flaws. Especially when it came to fighting alone, she completely surpassed her predecessors in all aspects. Brando was originally worried that the nun princess might not be able to accept the fact that she was created as a weapon of war. But it turned out that he was thinking too much. When he told her his guess, she did not show too much shock. Perhaps it was because the conversation between Brendel and Blanc had shaken her enough, or perhaps it was because the princess seemed to have finally found a way to pursue the life she wanted. She quickly accepted the fact. In fact, she had been trying to manipulate the Book of Gaia under the guidance of the war goddesses. That was the reason why Brendel asked Andrea so many questions. But she's not improving very quickly. Andrea was slightly disappointed when she mentioned the princess. "I wonder who was teaching her before this. If I find out, I'll definitely teach him a lesson. He's simply misleading her. The creator is such an excellent body, but he's teaching her so badly that she can't even differentiate between the 4 limbs and the 5 grains." Brando thought that it was a bit of an exaggeration to say that she was incompetent. But of course he understood that in the eyes of little girls like Andrea, those who did not know how to fight were no different from parasites. He could not help but wipe away the cold sweat in his heart because he remembered that one of the nun princess teachers was the great sage Vala. Is it because the fire seed is not compatible? Brando suddenly thought of this. The fire seed of God, used by the creators, was actually the source of the god's power. It was the flame of divinity. Although the heart of the dragon was high grade, it did not reach that level, not to mention that the latter was originally a substitute. However, when he replaced the heart of the dragon for the nun princess, the core of the latter was even worse. It was almost like a magical transmission device, which was not as good as the heart of the storm in his body. But according to Andrea, the moment the creators were created, they should have a fire seed of God. Andrea nodded and said, "That's part of the reason. However, the heart of the dragon isn't that bad. Sir, in my opinion, Her Highness' current situation should be the fault of those who taught her. They actually taught her to be a pacifist. This is simply unforgivable." Brando secretly thought that the pacifist was unforgivable. Although there were many enemies in this world, there were always some who had good intentions. If the whole civilized world was full of muscles like these violent girls of the goddess of war's guards, it would be too terrible. He thought for a moment and wisely decided not to answer this question. "What does Princess Magadol think?" he asked. "It's okay. Her Highness is not particularly depressed. As long as her confidence is still there, then the rest is a matter of time." Andrea gritted her teeth. "But we don't have much time." Brando nodded. Indeed, there was not much time left for this world. At this time, Andrea suddenly stopped and asked, "Compared to this, my lord, I am more concerned about the whereabouts of that young lady." "That lady? You're talking about Freya?" Brendel finally realized what she was talking about. Andrea nodded. "Yes, I still remember you called me Freya at that time. My lord, is that her name?" "Yes, at that time I mistook you for someone else because the light wings behind your back were too similar." Brando now knew that the light wings these girls of the goddess of war used in battle were called the wings of Tiamat, which came from the remote projection of Tiamat. In fact, it was the power given to them by the dragon of war. In fact, Freya's inheritance also came from the dragon of war. "I can't wait to see this sister, my lord," Andrea replied excitedly. Brando did not understand her excitement. "Don't you have many companions? Why are you so excited about Freya?" "Because she is a sister who grew up in Wound. My lord, this has a special meaning to us." "What meaning?" "This is the goddess of war's coat of arms, my lord." Andrea pointed to the silver mark on her forehead. "Our coat of arms is divided into 3 flame patterns, but my lord told us that this young lady has 5 flame patterns on her forehead. Do you know what this means, my lord?" Brando shook his head. "Her inheritance is earlier than ours. She could be the previous goddess of war. If her inheritance is complete, then she could be much more powerful than us." Andrea said excitedly. "The key is that Miss Freya's inheritance came from the war slate, which means that this kind of inheritance can be replicated. Your inheritance can also be inherited through the war slate?" Brando asked in surprise. "No, not necessarily, but there is such a possibility. The war slate is actually just a medium to store information. It was created to provide the golden folk, and the creator with a means to quickly absorb knowledge. Oh yes, I haven't told you yet, but the one who is most compatible with the war slate is actually Princess Magadol. She can absorb the inheritance of any number of war slates without any hindrance. The princess is a perfect warrior. What a pity." She wanted to complain again, but Brando quickly interrupted her because they had already arrived at their destination. Oh. Chapter 1329. The Queen of Madara and a priest of the goddess of the dead moon stood beside the podium. The priest was wearing a black and purple robe with a black cloak that was fastened with copper buckles on his shoulders. There was a black dragon pattern that extended to the bottom of the robe. Brando's pattern represented the status of the priests of the goddess of the dead moon in the holy temple. The lower-level priests usually wore purple moon patterns, while the higher-level priests could use cats or skeletons, the difference between the ordinary priests and the executioners. The higher-level priests and priests could use spiders, hydras, and waves. The undead worshipped the sea of the dead moon. However, only one person in the entire dead moon holy temple could have a dragon pattern, and that was the Lord Officiant of the dead moon holy temple. Brando squinted his eyes. He did not expect that the 2 most powerful figures in Madara would meet him at the same time. Although he could not remember who the Lord Officiant of the Dead Moon Holy Temple was, he at least understood that in this era, the Lord Officiant's authority was not below the Queen of Madara. He might even be more powerful. After all, before the birth of the Mercury Staff, the Dead Moon Holy Temple had enjoyed a transcendent status in the kingdom of the dead for thousands of years. Seeing the 2 of them, Andrea naturally shut her mouth. Brando bowed to the 2 of them. The queen was indifferent, but the Lord Officiant of the Dead Moon Holy Temple returned the greeting. The etiquette of the undead was very special. They clenched their right fist and placed it on their chest, and lowered their head naturally as if they were mourning. This process lasted for 2 to 3 seconds, and was the highest etiquette for the undead to show their respect for the eternal death and rest. The Lord Officiant was a human. As everyone knew, the goddess of the dead moon, who represented eternal death and rest, could only be a human priest. There were no undead in the Dead Moon Holy Temple. Even the lowest level staff and apprentices in the Holy Temple were all humans. This was also a miracle in the Empire. But for the past 1,000 years, the Holy Temple had been operating according to this rule. The goddess favored the kingdom of the dead, but she would not allow the dead to appear in her kingdom. The undead were well aware of this and adhered to this rule. Day after day, the clergy of the Holy Temple of the Dying Moon gradually became the majority of the human dark nobles in Madara. However, although they were humans, Brando knew that this did not mean that they shared the same interests as most of the creatures on the continent. Just like most undead wizards were humans, they were also the enemies of Erwin, Saint-Tossel, and Cruz. Not only that, but they were also the leaders and decision-makers of all wars. They also happened to be the ones who caused the most disasters of the kingdoms. The Dead Moon Holy Temple played the same role. In Wonde, every war had a religious background, and the undead were no exception. Before the Mercury Staff appeared, they were the ones who united the undead and launched an attack on Wonde. After the Mercury Staff appeared, they once again stood behind the scenes. Brando knew that without the support of the Dead Moon Holy Temple, the Queen would not have been able to unify the land of the dead in such a short time and become the ruler of Madara in name. In the following decades, the Dead Moon Holy Temple stood firmly behind her. They repeatedly sent down the goddess of the Dead Moon's oracles to remove all obstacles for the Mercury Staff until this huge empire was established. After Brando bowed, he saw Delphian standing at the side. The Prime Minister's daughter noticed Brando's gaze and gave him a look, indicating that the negotiation was successful. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. He was more afraid that the Queen would go back on her words. Even though the Mercury Staff was still in his hands and he still had the upper hand, who knew if this domineering woman would disregard everything and attack them after returning to her familiar territory? In the past 2 months, he had been warned more than once by the Queen's actions, which told him what it meant to be unpredictable. The Queen of Madara naturally noticed the subtle interaction between Brando and Delphian, but she did not care at all. "This is Archbishop Philip." She briefly introduced him to Brando. From the Queen's cold tone, Brando understood that the person in front of him was the sincere Philip. The latter was the Archbishop of the Dead Moon Holy Temple from the end of the First Era to the first 40 years of the Second Era. His greatest achievement was to support the Supreme of Madara to unify the Empire. However, Brando did not know when exactly he became the Archbishop of the Dead Moon Holy Temple, but he did not expect him to have already ascended to this position. In history, Philip was a very low-key person. He was born in a dark noble family in the realm of eternal death. He joined the Holy Temple at the age of 12 and became a clergy apprentice. After that, his path of promotion was not remarkable. He rarely made mistakes and was devout and deeply trusted by his mentors. His path of promotion was not smooth, but he did not encounter any major setbacks either. It was as if he was diligent all the way to the center of the Holy Temple. The process of him ascending to the position of head priest was even more lackluster, because in this era, the Undead Moon Temple could not find a more outstanding genius. His only advantage was that he was more suitable than the other competitors, and because of this, he obtained the most revered position in the Undead Moon Kingdom. Logically speaking, such a person should lack the opportunistic nature of great people. To put it bluntly, he lacked the courage to stake everything on a single throw. He should be moderate and cautious, and like to stick to the old rules. However, such a person had stood firmly behind the Mercury Staff from the beginning. Even when the power of the Emperor of Madara had not yet emerged, he had never wavered. His whole life was to contribute to the Mercury Staff's efforts to unify the Dead Moon Empire. According to the joking words of many players, with the support of the good old man Philip, even a pig should have become the Emperor of Madara. This saying was not without reason. Before the rise of the Mercury Staff, the Dead Moon Holy Temple held almost all the power of speech in the Dark Kingdom. As the Archbishop of the Dead Moon Holy Temple, the only difference between him and the later Emperor of the Empire was that he did not have absolute control over the undead lords. Other than that, he was no different from the Supreme. However, a person who held such power and influence had chosen to create a person who could stand above the temple. It was as if he had taken the initiative to hand over the authority of the temple to someone else. Some people believe that he did this to achieve the unification of the empire, but there were also people who questioned whether he had such lofty ambitions. There were also people who believed that he had received an oracle from the goddess of the dead moon. However, there were all kinds of theories that could not describe the Lord Officiator of the Dead Moon Temple. Until he stepped down from the position of Officiator of the Dead Moon Temple and gave it to someone else, all the legends about him seemed to be a confusing puzzle. Speaking of which, this was the first time Brando had met this famous person in history. However, in this era there were too many heroes and legends. At least compared to the woman beside him, Archbishop Philip was nothing. In his mind, this archbishop's presence was exactly like that. His experience was like a legend, but it could not stand up to careful scrutiny. The feeling he gave people was that he was very ordinary. Compared to ordinary people, he was mysterious and unfathomable. However, compared to the real legendary heroes of this era, he was just SOSO. But no matter what, anyone who had heard of this person would more or less be curious about him. They were curious about what kind of belief he had in his heart at this moment, and what kind of belief supported him to stand firmly behind the Mercury staff until the Dark Kingdom was unified. At this moment, Brando looked at the Archbishop and could not help but have such a thought in his mind. Philip seemed to be a little dull and did not notice his gaze. After returning the greeting to Brando, he took off the hat of his robe, revealing a somewhat pale face. It was the face of a middle-aged man without any distinguishing features. There were some grayish-brown patches on his cheeks, which looked like livor mortis. Due to the long-term erosion of dark magic, this was a prominent feature of the clergy of Clyce. But it was this seemingly submissive middle-aged man. After Her Majesty the Queen of Madara introduced him to Brando, she turned her head and looked at him, as if she was asking for his opinion. Brando noticed this strange scene. He could not help but look at the old man. He saw Philip nodding stiffly. Only then did Her Majesty the Queen turn her head and looked at him. Count, these days there have been too many troublemakers, so I can't spare time to receive you all. If there is any neglect, you won't blame me, will you? Brando naturally would not take Her Majesty's polite words seriously. He shook his head. Her Majesty the Queen nodded with satisfaction. That's very good. The promise I made to you on the battlefield that day has now been fulfilled. I believe Mr. Count will not turn a blind eye to the sincerity shown by Madara, will you? Brando nodded again. Now the army of Madara has withdrawn from Erewhon. Those sinners that Mr. Count wants to punish have now been handed over to you. I have also fulfilled all of your requests. I have made a huge concession, but I believe Mr. Count also understands that a deal is mutual, right? For this sentence, Brando could be said to have been waiting for a long time. He knew that Her Majesty the Queen was not a person who would always give in. She appeared to be weak on one side, which could only mean that she must have other plans on the other side. But these days, he had not figured out why Her Majesty made such a big concession. Perhaps in the eyes of others, it was to get back the Mercury staff. But as the person involved, Brando knew very well that the Mercury staff was handed to him by Her Majesty the Queen herself. If that was the case, then she needed another explanation for what she had done that day. At that time he was completely immersed in controlling the 5 sacred swords, and accepting the authority given to him by Kai. He only vaguely remembered that the Queen said something related to responsibility, but at that time, he did not take it to heart. You said the same thing to me back then, Count. The Supreme of the Undead said. You shook your head at me, but it doesn't matter. I still gave you the scepter that represents the supreme power. Because no matter whether you understand it or not, since you have made a choice, you must bear this responsibility. What do you mean? Do you understand what the Mercury staff represents? The Queen of Madara asked. Are you talking about the symbolic meaning of the staff in the Kingdom of the Dead Moon, Your Majesty? The Queen shook her head. That's not the most important thing. You have 5 of the 7 sacred swords. You should understand what kind of path this is. It's full of thorns and is not a smooth path. Originally, I could bear all of this for you, but you refused. From the moment you chose to walk the path of ascending to the throne, its responsibility followed you like a shadow. Ascending to the throne. Brando frowned. What are you trying to say, Your Majesty? Didn't anyone tell you that in every era Wond has a king? In our era, the sages divided it into 4. That is why the world is in chaos. But it doesn't matter. The crown has always been there. After Odin, it is waiting for the next successor. A person who can lead everyone and change the fate of the whole world. You should know who I am talking about, right? Brando was silent. It was not the first time he heard of such a thing. Miss Tada, the Dragon Queen, and Haku had all said similar things to him. He did have the blessing of the 5 sacred swords, but what he wanted to do was to save the Roman people. If it was like what Lutz said, that gathering the 7 keys to open the door was an opportunity, then he would seize it at all costs. But he had never thought of inheriting Odin's path and changing the fate of the whole world. It was not that he belittled himself, but he believed that the opportunity that Martha left for the mortals was definitely not such a choice. Because no one could control the fate of others. This era of mortals was born because of this. Ever since the star fell to the earth, Odin and the 4 sages, as well as the many divine citizens of the Truth Symposium, the gods and their followers, as well as the countless successors behind them, countless people had sacrificed and bled, struggling and shouting unyieldingly. The mortal world had staggered forward and reached this point. But in this era they had to turn back and let everything go back to the beginning? No. Brando silently denied this in his heart. He did not think that this was the right path, just like his sonorous refutation in front of the Silver Queen that day. Because in this era countless people were fighting for their own fate, for their homes, for their loved ones. The figures of Freya, Princess Griffine, Haruz, Kargleis, the people of Abes, the young people of the White Lion Guards, the Knight Eco of Lantanailan, and the King of Sherman appeared in front of him. Even in this small kingdom, people were still fighting for a chance to live, even if what they did was not worth mentioning in this magnificent era. Just like the fate of Erewhon, a small remote kingdom, could not move the footsteps of the whole world. People's eyes were always fixed on the long term, and ignored the short term and precious things. Perhaps it was just like the Queen of Madara in front of him. She only needed one order, and all of Awin's hard work would come to naught. And he himself had grown to such a point. He felt the power of the sage for the first time on the battlefield of Fenhodos, and was now only one step away from the final threshold. Just like the queen could crush Erewhon, an ant, with a flip of her hand, and now his power seemed to be able to easily change the fate of Madara. This was also what he was doing now. That small kingdom seemed to be no longer able to hold his footsteps and hold his gaze. Everything that he had done in the past to be able to do now seemed to be easily achieved with just a word. The feeling of controlling the fate of others was indeed fascinating. But this was not what he wanted. The redemption that Erewhon needed was not this, because he deeply understood this point. The future of this ancient kingdom was not based on his words alone. Perhaps he could make Erewhon glorious today, but in the distant future, it would once again fall into this cycle. The decay and rise and fall of the kingdom was like an unsolvable loop, going back and forth. Everything that the 4 sages had done had already given the mortals an answer, hadn't they? The lonely fool had been waiting for such an answer for 1,000 years. But its answer would never be to repeat the past. Brando's eyes seemed to see Erewhon's most glorious era. King Eric was in front of him. He put down his sword and nodded to him, telling him that this was the answer he was looking for. Erewhon was born because of a person's will, but it was also dimmed because of this will. Now it would not repeat this path. One would be the same. Brando shook his head. At that moment, the answer of the 4 sages seemed to have passed by him. That may sound beautiful, Your Majesty, he replied. But that is not the answer I want, and I don't think that is the answer Wond wants either. Then what is the answer you want? The Queen of Madara did not seem to have expected his answer. Her eyes flashed slightly, and she asked again. Brando just shook his head. I haven't thought about it yet, Your Majesty, but I think that everyone has the right to decide their own fate, and not rely on the hands of others. Everything that one cherishes should be left to the whims of others. Although it sounds beautiful, the reality is very cruel. If the sages and the people of God all had such thoughts, the mortals might not have been able to wait until this day. and Wonde would have been destroyed long ago. The Queen of Madara said coldly, 5 of the 7 holy swords are in your hands, which means that you almost have the highest authority of the law of Tiamat. With such power, do you want to avoid responsibility? I've never thought of running away from my responsibilities. I will face Dusk head-on, but not as a savior, just because I'm also a member of Vaunt, so I have interest to fight for it. Besides, I am not only fighting for it. Brando replied quietly, I will fight for everything that I cherish, even if it will be destroyed in the end. But Wonde needs this redemption. This is my redemption, Your Majesty. The mortals, including you and me, will personally experience this war, because it belongs to each of us. No one is an exception. Perhaps one day, we will understand what the opportunity Martha left for us is. The Queen of Madara maintained a calm expression and looked at him coldly. Very good, she replied. Chapter 1331. Very well. When Her Majesty the Queen said this, a sudden tremor came from the direction of the altar of the goddess of the dead moon. It was as if something had crashed into the temple. That thing must have been a giant beast the size of a mountain. The whole hall of the dead moon shook with a loud bang. The white bone pillars creaked strangely, and the arches above their heads buzzed. It was as if the whole world was shaking, and sand poured down like a waterfall. Andrea took a step back and stabilized her center of gravity. She raised her head, her silver eyes revealing a look of vigilance. Unknowingly, a pitch-black spear had appeared in her hand. It was her light spear Raven. Brando's body shook, and he immediately looked around vigilantly. This tremor was clearly of the same origin as the one he felt a moment ago. His first thought was that the Eternal City was experiencing an earthquake, but it was at this time that the third tremor came. This tremor was more obvious than the previous two. The entire hall of the dead moon suddenly shook, and everyone in the hall had an illusion that the hall had moved by 1 or 2 centimeters. With the sound of glass shattering, the rose-arched windows on both sides of the corridor that depicted the classic legends of the Dark Codex shattered at the same time. Whether it was the dragon slayer Hudson, the advent of darkness, the first rising of the dead moon, Ben Burton and his followers, or even the blood and the lamb, they all fell from the windowsills and fell heavily to the ground, shattering into colorful glass shards. The followers in the hall moved forward and backward like waves, and the followers who lost their balance fell to the ground in rows. It was as if an invisible scythe had swung over the heads of the crowd, and where it passed, the crowd immediately became shorter. Kacha! Brando seemed to hear the sound of something cracking. The sound came from the front of the hall, and he and Andrea subconsciously looked up. The two of them were surprised to see that on the holy statue of the goddess of the dead moon, which was more than 10 meters tall, there was a crack that was a few centimeters wide starting from the neck. In the continuous tremor of the hall, small fragments rolled down from the crack, and then as if the goddess lowered her head, the holy statue broke from the neck, and a head that was as tall as a person rolled down from the sky, falling straight towards Queen Madara and Bishop Philip below. Andrea was so shocked that she did not realize what was going to happen next. Brendel, on the other hand, did not have such a deep impression of the situation. He reminded her immediately, "Don't worry about it too much. Be careful." But he immediately realized that as the Queen of the Dead Moon Empire, it was impossible that she did not have a protective holy object on her, and the falling stones were unlikely to cause any harm to her. The goddess' head fell from the sky, and it looked very frightening. But in this world of magic, its power was not even comparable to a stone shot from a catapult. Sure enough, a conspicuous arc of light appeared 10 feet above the queen's head, and the falling statue hit the arc of light as if it had hit an immovable iron plate. The tip of the goddess' nose touched the ground first, and it immediately collapsed, and then the whole head completely broke from the broken nose, turning into a few harmless pieces of broken stone. With a bang, it exploded and fell to the ground, and a few pieces splashed on Philip, who was not far away, hitting his robe, but the latter's face was stiff and he did not even frown. This calmness, even in the face of a landslide, deeply shocked Brando. How could such a person be a mediocre person? He could not help but think that he must have seen a ghost to believe the unreliable rumors circulating outside. How could such a mediocre person become the bishop of the Dead Moon Temple, the second most powerful person in Madara, and possibly the most powerful person in this era? But why would such a person be willing to assist a person with no background and origin to become the Queen of Madara? Was it just for the Mercury staff? Brando was more willing to believe that perhaps the bishop had really received an oracle that allowed him to see through the fog of the future and see Madara, the unification of the Dark Dead Moon Empire. Lady Clyce? At this time Andrea suddenly cried out. Only then did Brando realize something. He looked up and found that only half of the statue of the goddess was left. Her upper body was completely cracked, and after rolling down from her head, the parts above her waist also fell apart, turning into several pieces that fell down from both sides. One of the pieces hit the giant spider at her feet and smashed it into pieces. Her 2 arms fell to the ground and broke into several pieces. One of the round forearms was still rolling on the obsidian floor, down the steps below the altar, and all the way to the hall below. It finally stopped in front of a young acolyte of the dead moon. He looked as if he was scared stiff as he stared at the arm of the goddess, as if he was not looking at a statue, but at the bloody broken arm of the real goddess of the dead moon, Clyce. When Brando saw the expression on the acolyte's face, he suddenly realized what had happened. The statue of the goddess of the dead moon had collapsed. Perhaps this did not sound like a big deal, and could at most be regarded as an ominous sign. But Brando knew that this was not the case, because this was a world of magic and gods. This was the central hall of the Dead Moon Temple. Although this statue had not appeared for thousands of years, it actually symbolized the authority of the goddess of the dead moon, Clyce, in this world. But now it had shattered. In the thousands of years of history of the holy city of the undead, this was not the first time it had been tested by a disaster. Since the establishment of the holy city of the undead, it had experienced hundreds of big and small disasters, including natural disasters and man-made disasters. During the year of the Brown Lion, the holy city of the undead once had a fire in the holy city, which had just been rebuilt not long ago. 90% of the holy city of the undead was reduced to ashes, but only the Great Hall remained unscathed. When the fire spread to the 33rd step outside the Great Hall, it was miraculously extinguished, followed by heavy rain that lasted for 2 days and 2 nights. At the beginning of the First Era, the Wind Elves invaded the land of eternal death. That was the only time in the last 1,300 years that the Dead Moon Kingdom had been invaded. The Wind Elves killed the undead Lord Skeletal Gangrene, and their army was once directed at the Holy City. At that time, the Wind Elves' commander declared that he would completely destroy the temple. But not long after he said that, civil strife broke out in Saint Tossel. The elves' attack was thus left unsettled, and the Holy City of the Dead Souls avoided a catastrophe. Then came the year of the Croaking Frogs, which happened less than 300 years ago. The great earthquake in Ekka's Canyon affected the Holy City of the Dead Souls. 70% of the buildings in the city collapsed, and even half of the main hall of the temple collapsed. But this statue was not damaged at all, and stood tall among the broken walls. Later, when the believers of the Dead Moon rebuilt the temple, they used this statue as the center to reshape the hall, and that was how the majestic and magnificent Dead Moon Temple was built today. But today, this statue of the goddess collapsed with a loud bang. Although the tremors in the hall were violent, it was still far from comparable to the great earthquake in the year of the Croaking Frogs. The believers of the Dead Moon were all humans. They may not have experienced the great earthquake 200 years ago, but there was no lack of old souls among the undead lords here who had lived for a long time. When they saw this scene, they were immediately stunned. A buzzing sound rose from the hall, as if a lid had been lifted. The whispers of the believers became louder in an instant. The fear of the believers in the front row spread like an infectious disease, and quickly infected the people behind. The expressions on the faces of the believers became incomparably terrified. They finally lost their footing, and some of them stood up from the crowd, frantically struggling to rush out. But before they could run far, a sharp arrow shot out from the shadows and hit the backs of those people. The arrow seemed to be imbued with unparalleled power. It turned into a black light and pierced through the backs of those people, plunging straight into the ground. The tail feathers were still trembling. Madara's skeleton archers rarely use these arrows, but there's one exception, and that's the Dark Rangers. He subconsciously looked at the 2 sides of the hall, but even with his perception he could not see anything. Madara's skeleton archers rarely used these arrows, but there was one exception, and that was the Dark Rangers. He subconsciously looked at the two sides of the hall, but even with his perception he could not see anything. This hall seemed to be occupied by a huge will, shielding his perception. His five senses could only extend to a dozen meters like a normal person before they were blocked by a dozen pillars. These dozen black arrows deterred the crowd, and the believers who were becoming chaotic stopped in their tracks. They turned back and looked at Her Majesty the Queen and Philip at the altar. What impressed Brando was that Her Majesty the Queen was not particular enough to use weapons in such a place and cause such a massacre. But Archbishop Philip beside her did not seem to have seen it, and his expression did not even change slightly. If such a thing happened in the Leo Palace of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the royal family of the Cruz people would be waiting to break off relations with the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In the sanctuary that represented the majesty of the Golden Flame, openly slaughtering its believers, what was this if not disobeying the gods? But this scene also made Brando understand one thing, and that was that everything that happened in front of him did not seem to be sudden. At least Her Majesty the Queen and Archbishop Philip had been prepared, and both of them seemed to have expected this to happen. Brando looked at the undead lords and high-ranking priests standing below, and he saw the same look of shock in their faces and in the soul flames in their eyes. He turned back and looked back at the Queen of Madara and Philip. This was not an earthquake, and an earthquake could not destroy the icon of Claire unless the earthquake happened in another place, and that was outside the elemental frontier. Something happened to the gods. Chapter 1332. Although the gods had left this world for thousands of years, there was no doubt that their majesty and will still existed in this world. Now the last bit of authority they had left in this world had also collapsed. There was only one possibility, and that was that the gods had completely given up on Wond. The believers of the Dead Moon waited anxiously in the hall. What happened in front of them was enough to completely topple their beliefs. However, the Supreme One with the Mercury staff did not say anything. The bloody reality reminded them that the best choice at the moment was not to choose. The dozen or so cold corpses reminded them of this point. Soon, a few liches came out from the darkness behind. They came to the corpses and placed their hands on the heads of the corpses. The corpses stood up shakily and followed the liches out of the hall like puppets. Brando saw this scene and of course knew that it was the undead transformation spell. Most of the believers in this hall were the children of the dark nobles in the holy city. The Queen of Madara dared to kill them, but she had to give an explanation to the families behind them. This was actually a political miracle in Madara. As human dark nobles, especially the saints, they had a natural immunity. No matter what purpose they were executed for, they had a chance to be transformed into undead and serve the empire again, except for blasphemers. However, this was not a good choice for these human dark nobles, because most of them joined the holy temple from a young age to learn how to serve the gods. Most of them were almost isolated from their families. Even if they returned to their families as undead, they would not have any chance to stand out in this life. They might even be chased out to lead the army to fight against the elves and humans. In fact, it was almost the same as being cannon fodder. "Your Majesty," Brando said. The Queen of Madara turned around and shook her head at him. There were still some aftershocks in the temple. The 17 white bone pillars were still shaking, but it was not as obvious as before. In the aftershocks, only Her Majesty the Queen and the Lord Officiant beside her were able to keep their expressions unchanged. Delphian went to Brando's side with a pale face. She was obviously not informed in advance. The scene just now had frightened her. A piece of stone flew past her left shoulder. If it had been a little higher, this daughter of the Prime Minister would have died. Although she was now a summoned creature of a planeswalker and could be resurrected even if she died, for this young lady, she was obviously not familiar enough with this identity. What happened? Brando noticed Delphian coming to his side and immediately asked in a low voice. But the latter shook her head. She used her hand to brush away the wet hair on her forehead and answered with a trembling voice. "I don't know. Because the negotiations have already come to an end. Her Majesty the Queen will only meet you. Now that I think about it, she deliberately delayed the end of the negotiations until today. She and Archbishop Philip must have planned this." The two were almost whispering. Brando used his own law to seal the space, and he did not care if Her Majesty the Queen and Philip, who were a few steps away, noticed anything. "Why?" he asked. I don't know. Delphian bit her lower lip and shook her head. It's too sudden. But don't worry, I don't think Her Majesty the Queen is targeting us. Brando actually thought the same. He felt that the woman in front of him did not need to go through so much trouble to deal with him. He looked up and saw Her Majesty the Queen pick up the Mercury staff. But she did not speak. The one who spoke was Philip, who was beside her. The Archbishop, who had always been a wooden figure, took a step forward and stood in front of Her Majesty the Queen. He looked up and said sternly, "Be quiet. Return to your seats and continue chanting. You must remain pious. No matter what you see or hear, you must not doubt the faith in your heart. Your Lord your God is calling for you. Go back, return to your seats, and pay your respects to eternal death and rest." His tone was not loud, but there seemed to be some kind of magic in his words. The believers looked at each other, but the bloodstains on the ground were enough to remind them what they should do. Soon, the hall reverberated with the low and oppressive chanting of prayers. Philip turned his head and looked gloomily at the remnant of the icon. Brando found the opportunity to speak again. "Your Majesty, you have to give me an explanation." "I will." Her Majesty looked at him and replied coldly, "But not now. I don't have that much time to explain everything to you. You have to answer a question of mine." "If it's the previous question," Brando replied, "then I have already answered you." Her Majesty the Queen's cold gaze swept over him. "I hope you will fulfill your promise. But responsibility is responsibility. You will understand this. Could Odin use a simple excuse to deny everything he has shouldered? But in the history we know, he and the four wise ones did not choose to act as cowards. Naturally, I won't either." "I hope so." She lifted her chin. The hall of the Temple of the Dying Moon had already cracked open. A beam of silver-white moonlight descended from the vault and shone on the altar, making Her Majesty's face appear snow-white. "Philip, take them to the sanctuary of the Silent Death. Soaps Netta protect the Archbishop." "Wait, what does this mean?" Brando froze for a moment. This woman was the one who summoned them, but after asking him a few strange questions, she wanted them to leave. He did not care what the Queen was up to, but he was not someone who would be easily manipulated. He immediately had Andrea stop the undead lords who were walking up to the stage. He frowned and looked at the Queen on the stage. "I said, I will explain everything to you, but not now." Queen Madara also frowned. "Madara has already satisfied all your requests. I need your attitude now. Can't you even do this?" "What do you mean?" The hall shook again. Behind Clyce's holy statue, the dark wall creaked. Some bricks protruded out of the wall and fell to the ground. Brando watched as a crack of a few meters appeared on the wall. It was as if something was behind the wall, ready to break out. Madara turned back to look at him, and then turned around with a calm expression. "Are you really going to discuss this with me here?" "But..." Brando hesitated. "Let's go. I don't have time to talk nonsense with you." "You are not a child, Count," Queen Madara replied coldly. "When I gave you the Mercury staff, did I say so much nonsense?" Brando froze for a moment and suddenly realized that it seemed to be true. Although he had always regarded Her Majesty as a great enemy, she really didn't seem to have done anything against him other than giving such an order on the battlefield. But the final result was still beyond his expectations. He looked at the Queen and nodded silently. "I hope your explanation is satisfactory." After he finished speaking, he looked around and took in everything in the dilapidated hall. At this moment, he had a premonition that perhaps the scene that was playing out here today was not limited to the holy city of the undead. But it did not matter. He could wait for the Queen's explanation. With that, he turned around and left the hall with Andrea and Delphian. The lords of the undead wanted to stop them, but before they could get close, they were pushed away by an invisible force and crashed into the crowd of believers, causing a commotion. The expressionless Philip glanced at the Queen of Madara, but the latter ignored him and nodded her head silently. The officiator immediately followed after them. The hall was still trembling from the tremors, and from time to time, sand and stones would fall from the dome of the holy cathedral. The believers trembled in fear, looking at Brendel and the other two walking in the middle of the hall with fear and envy, wishing that they were the ones who left at that moment. The sanctuary of the Silent Death was located in the core area of the holy sanctum of the dying moon. A place like this was often a sacred place for meditation in a holy sanctum. Delphian happened to be there recently, and she gestured to Brando as she walked, telling him that there might be some situation there. There was a long corridor outside the holy sanctum. Brando looked back and saw that Philip had not caught up. He waved his hand at the latter, indicating that she did not need to be so careful. What's going on? When I was there a few days ago, I saw the undead building something there, my lord. What is it? I only saw it from afar, but I thought that since the undead could let me go there, it shouldn't be anything important. I only thought that they were repairing the interior of the holy sanctum. Brando frowned, but his thoughts were similar to Delphian's. Since Her Majesty was not afraid of Delphian seeing it, there should not be anything too fishy about the sanctuary of the Silent Death. However, this matter piqued his curiosity. Since Queen Madara had already made arrangements there, she must have been preparing for today's matter. The sanctuary of the Silent Death was to the north of the holy sanctum of the dying moon sanctum. After passing through the long corridor, one could see the main entrance of the sanctuary. However, the moment Brando stepped into the sanctuary of the Silent Death, he seemed to have sensed something and heard a shrill scream from the void. He froze and turned around, but Archbishop Philip's deadpan face suddenly appeared in front of him. Lord Officiator, did something happen? They're back, Count Philip. To Brendel's surprise, the Lord Archbishop actually responded to his question and slowly opened his mouth to answer. The gods. Oh. Chapter 1333. Master. A clear and surprised cry came from behind. Brendel turned around in surprise and saw Huang Hua, with her black hair draped over her shoulders, walking out of the place of death. She wore a red swordswoman's uniform with a golden phoenix on it. She held a sword in her hand, followed by Mr. Liu and Fang Qi. Huang Hua, why are you here? Brando was stunned and asked. Miss Delphian asked us to come here. Huang Hua glanced at the Prime Minister's daughter standing beside Brando and answered. It's Her Majesty's order. Delphian lowered her head and explained softly. Aren't you afraid that she'll kill us all? Brando said angrily. The Prime Minister's daughter did not speak. She looked at Brando calmly. Brando understood what this woman meant from her eyes. She deliberately tied Huang Hua, the Princess of the Nine Phoenixes, to her own chariot so that Queen Madara would not act rashly. What an unnecessary move. Delphian did not refute, but Huang Hua defended her. It's not Miss Delphian's fault. Master, it's Huang Hua's idea. Brando shook his head. Although his student was smart, she was still too naive in front of Delphian, a scheming woman. She was betrayed and still wanted to count the money for others. However, Delphian was his subordinate, and he did not want to expose her in front of her. He just turned his head and glared at her. Lord Officiant, what does Her Majesty mean? He turned his head and asked. Before he finished speaking, the ground suddenly shook violently again. With a few cracking sounds, a few holes a few inches wide extended from one side of the wall. Brando's words were stuck in his throat. He turned his head and saw that the wall of the hall had begun to tilt. Andrea, who was in that direction, also looked up and saw this scene. Without another word, Brendel picked up the Prime Minister's daughter and grabbed Huang Hua's hand with his other hand. He called out in a low voice. What are you waiting for? Run! With that, he dragged Phoenix Hua and charged into the sanctuary of solitary death. Someone was faster than him, and that was Andrea. She spread her wings of light and overtook everyone in an instant. After a few steps, they would reach the gate of the sanctuary of solitary death. Inside the gate was an open patio about 300 feet wide. On the green meadow there were plants like laurel, black roses, and heather. Brando landed on the meadow and threw Delphian and Phoenix Hua onto the meadow. He then used the threads of law to stabilize the two. Behind him, the long corridor to the south of the Sanctum of Silence collapsed with a few crisp cracking sounds. Dust rose high into the air, and after a series of coughs, Fang Qi and Sir Liu emerged from within, their faces covered in dust. Brendel looked past the two of them, knowing that the collapse of a building would not be able to hurt an elemental awakened powerhouse. But he soon saw the spotless Archbishop Philip slowly walking out of the smoke and dust with a calm expression. Seeing that the three of them were fine, Brando had time to remove the threads of law, and let Phoenix Hua and Delphian slowly land on the ground. The princess of the Kingdom of Nine Phoenix bowed respectfully to him. "Thank you for saving us, teacher." Brando waved his hand carelessly. He did it purely because Phoenix Hua was still young. But in fact, even if he did not do anything, the former might not have been injured. Teacher's kindness is as heavy as a mountain. Phoenix Hua is not being overly courteous, Phoenix Hua replied seriously. Brando could only accept her bow helplessly. His student and Haru's seemed to be two extremes. One was timid and difficult to make his own decisions, while the other was scrupulous and abided by the rules like a little adult. He looked up and observed the environment of the sanctuary. In fact, Andrea, who had entered the sanctuary first, had already been looking around. Like most religious buildings in Wonde, the sanctuary of the Dying Moon Sanctum was built in a small garden. This kind of courtyard in a majestic building was popular in the year of the return of the light. Its luxurious and serious style quickly became the standard of religious buildings. The monks of Wonde believed that being close to nature was conducive to harmony of mind and body. It was the best environment for meditation and quiet prayer. The believers of the Dying Moon followed suit and built such a sanctuary in the Dying Moon Sanctum. However, the style of the undead was very different from the style of humans and elves. A good courtyard garden was turned into a gloomy cemetery by the undead. Black and white roses were scattered on the dark green meadow, and there were also thorns as thick as an arm. There were also a few tombstones. Those who were buried in this place must have been saints of a certain era. By the way, if the saints were not expelled from the Dying Moon Sanctum, they would not be resurrected as undead. This was a blasphemy to the goddess, and it was a tradition of the Dying Moon Sanctum. At the other end of the courtyard, there was a pale Baroque garden pavilion covered with gloomy vines. Brando glanced over there, and did not see what Delphian said the undead were building. He turned to Archbishop Philip and asked, "Lord Officiator, what exactly is going on?" But before Archbishop Philip could answer his question, Andrea suddenly shouted, "Let's see who's in charge. Be careful." A solemn expression suddenly appeared on Archbishop Philip's usually wooden face. The man turned his head and looked at the ruins that were filled with smoke and dust. The others also looked in that direction. Brando's senses were the strongest, and he was the first to see a few long shadows extending out of the smoke and dust. It happened to be the southern wall of the Silent Death Sanctum, which no longer existed. But on the east and west sides of it, there was a small sanctum that had collapsed. A hideous opening extended out of the ruins, as though a knife had cut the grass and opened a bifurcated gap in the courtyard garden's meadow. At this moment, the strange shadows extended out from the crack. They were like black blood flowing on the meadow, but all of a sudden, they seemed to be pulled up from the ground by an invisible force. They stood up in a strange posture like chewing gum, and they were even laughing shrilly at the same time. The mouths of these shadows were also very strange. It was like a crack without any thickness, but the insides were blood red. They had 4 eyes, and the insides were burning with raging flames. They laughed shrilly as they surrounded the Silent Death Sanctum. Brando saw this and could not help but curse inwardly. Spawn of the evil god. He suddenly thought of Philip's words and his heart skipped a beat. The spawn of the evil god in Wonde did not refer to a specific type of monster. In fact, it was a general term for a group of monsters. They could be the descendants and heirs of the evil god, or they could be the hatchlings of abominations, or the evil thoughts that escaped from the nightmares of the gods. They had all kinds of strange appearances, so it was impossible to judge them from their appearance. But they all had one thing in common. They had incomplete dark divinity. Most people who knew a little about religion would be able to recognize these disgusting things at a glance. But it was useless to recognize them because most people could only wait for death when faced with divine creatures. Moreover, these shadows were not the descendants of those trash evil gods, demigods, lesser gods, or divine servants. Brando could already smell the dense power of law and order on their twisted bodies. In his previous life, he had only seen similar things a few times in the dreams and evil thoughts of the true gods. However, that was the evil thoughts of the gods. It was something that could not be avoided by any god. It did exist, but it was usually not a big threat. This was because once the gods discovered that their evil thoughts were born, they would kill them. When players discovered the nightmares or evil thoughts of the gods, They would often receive rewards and benefits from the gods. But he was sure that these things in front of him were the descendants of the true gods, the twisted descendants of the true gods. How did they come about? Brando already had an answer in his heart. He looked at Philip with a heavy expression and asked, "Lord Archbishop, you said that the gods had returned. Did you mean the goddess of the dead moon or everyone?" Archbishop Philip turned around and looked at him, but his wooden face seemed to be wearing a human skin mask. His cheeks twitched, but he did not speak. "The goddess of the dead moon has fallen? You already knew?" "She was only reawakened by someone, Count Philip." Archbishop Philip replied with an indifferent expression. As he spoke, he pulled out a scepter from under his robe. "Reawakened. Reawakened, that is the spirit of the gods, the spirit of the gods." Andrea muttered softly. She seemed to be very scared, her face was a little pale, and she kept repeating this sentence. "The spirit of the gods?" Brando had never seen the goddess of war show such an expression before, so he asked, "My lord, the goddess of the dead moon had already passed away in the previous era. There is only one possibility for her to be reawakened. That is what the Black Prophecy said. The wolf walks in front and the calamity follows. This is the calamity of the gods. The deceased gods are like spirits that have been reawakened. They once created this world, but now they want to destroy it with their own hands." "That is only a legend, Miss Andrea." Brando shook his head in disbelief. Although Babasha and the others believed in the Black Prophecy, he had always ignored this prophecy. After all, a prophecy was a prophecy. Half of his soul came from another world, so he had a strong resistance to things like the future and prophecies. However, Andrea shook her head vigorously and said with certainty, "My lord, there is such a possibility. There is such a possibility. If that legend is true." Chapter 1334. The gods won't really die. They just lose their power and sleep in the deep space. Legend has it that the Twilight Dragon planted a seed in the world of order in the previous era. The gods beat him at his own game and wanted to use that cage to seal him. That seed should have been destroyed, but it is said that he didn't die. He has been sleeping in this world. If the Twilight Dragon finds him, what will happen? Brando's heart skipped a beat. This sentence caught his attention and he asked subconsciously, "The Twilight Dragon will discover the true secret of our world. At that moment, death and despair will dominate everything. We will have no way to escape. Everything, including the fate of Martha and the divine people, will be covered by its spread wings." "The secret of our world?" Brando frowned. "Why is it this again?" he asked. "The secret of our world, what is it?" I don't know, my lord. That is just a legend, but that legend is true. You see, it has been realized." Brando suddenly realized that the girl's situation was a little strange. He glanced back and found that Andrea's eyes were pitch black, as if her pupils and the whites of her eyes had been swallowed by something. He was shocked and quickly turned around to grab her shoulders and shook her hard. "Wake up." Andrea was suddenly stunned. The darkness in her eyes quickly faded away. She looked at Brando in a daze. Suddenly, her legs went soft, and she knelt down subconsciously. Brando hurriedly supported her and shouted, "What's wrong, Miss Andrea?" "I'm fine." Andrea's face was pale. She finally came back to her senses. She grabbed Brando's strong arm and steadied herself. "I'm sorry, my lord. My mind has been taken away by the darkness." "Don't lose hope. Things are far from that stage." "I understand." Only then did Brando let go of her hand. He turned around and slowly made a motion of drawing a sword. A beam of golden flames flowed from his palm and formed a long sword covered in cracks. Holy Sword Odorfice, the most resistant holy sword among the 7 holy swords. At the same time, the path of golden flames had the meaning of purification and purity. It was most suitable to deal with the evil and distortion in the divine nightmare. However, the evil god's son was of the same origin as it, so it was naturally restrained by the holy sword. The other holy sword that was more suitable to deal with the evil god's son was the holy sword of light, Mysore. The reason was self-evident, but Brando did not have the latter at the moment. From the conversation between the 3 of them to Brando drawing the sword, only an instant had passed. Those distorted monsters had already walked close, and the screams in their mouths suddenly turned into terrifying screams. They then pounced over with bared fangs and claws. Before the claws of those shadows reached him, Brando could already feel a withering aura. That was the law and order that the goddess of the dead moon, Cleis, was in charge of. Unlike the kingdom of the dead that Hela was in charge of, Cleis protected the dead. She was the goddess of the undead, walking on the earth with suffering and despair, not the death of all things. Therefore, instead of saying that she was the goddess of the dead, it was better to say that she was the master of the gate to the kingdom of eternity. However, her eternity was not really a stagnation of time but an eternal rest. However, the law aura of Cleis on the evil god's son was even more chaotic and desperate. It was as if after devouring all things, the world was only left with an empty eternity. Such power swept across Brando's law line, and he could not help but shiver. At that moment he seemed to have seen the world after the end with his own eyes. After Wone died, all things fell silent, and only a gray dust was left between heaven and earth. There was neither space nor time. The corpses of the gods floated in this sea of ashes, and all life was completely silent. Only gray snowflakes fell from the sky, and purple lightning flashed above the clouds. However, that was the violent magic power of the Sea of Chaos. Brando's heart throbbed. He suddenly understood how the Silver Queen felt back then. Instead of living in such a world, it was better to let this world go crazy at the last moment. If one did not explode in silence, one would perish in silence. However, at the last moment he came to his senses. Fortunately, it was not the goddess of the dead moon, Cleis, who was affecting him, but her weak descendant. Brando broke out in a cold sweat and shouted, "Get out of my way!" The illusion in front of him disappeared, and only the evil god's son was left, waving its claws at him. In fact, this thing was not very strong. Its strength was only at the peak of the elemental enlightenment. However, Brando could see that these distorted things had not reached the point of full maturity. They seemed to have just escaped from a crack in the void, and were not familiar with this world with poor magic power. Once they grew up, the consequences would be unimaginable. These things could not be mentioned in the same breath as the trash of Rushta. Without thinking, he thrust his sword forward and pierced the shadow's heart. The monster was like a real person. It held its heart with both hands and let out a shrill scream. Its body fell backward, and when it fell to the ground, it seemed to turn into a thin sheet of paper. In an instant, the ice and snow melted away. Brando saw this strange scene and could not help but feel a chill. The evil god's son was terrifying because they were born from the distorted laws of this world. Therefore, they were completely different from the creatures of the Woned world. In other words, in the Amber Sword, they were born with the bad taste of the art designers. They were as disgusting as they could be. Thinking of this, the curses in his heart for those damned art designers took over, and he no longer felt so uncomfortable. Looking back, Archbishop Philip had already killed one of his opponents. The third to end the battle was Andrea. Although her previous performance was a bit abnormal, she was still a young girl from a fighting race, so dealing with the Dusk race was a piece of cake. Only Feng Qi and Mr. Liu encountered a little trouble. Brando helped them deal with their opponents one by one, leaving only Phoenix Fire. Mr. Liu saw this and wanted to help, but Brando stopped him and shook his head at him. Mr. Liu understood. He looked at the princess of the Jade Phoenix race with some worry, but in the end he did not help. Brando was not very worried. The descendants of Cleis and Phoenix Fire were similar in strength, but the nature of their power was very special. It was difficult for ordinary people to deal with them. Such opponents were not easy to find, and they were suitable for Phoenix Fire. Especially when these monsters were not mature yet, their threat was correspondingly reduced. After a while, Phoenix Fire would be no match for them. Soon, only the son of Diablo was left in the courtyard. Brando asked everyone to step back and leave enough space for Phoenix Fire to fight. Then he turned around holding the holy sword and asked Archbishop Philip, who was beside him word by word, "What's going on? What is going on right now? Lord Officiator, is the evil god about to descend upon this city?" Unlike before, Brando's voice now contained unspeakable anger. If there was no reasonable explanation, he would not mind killing the Archbishop of the Waning Moon Temple before dealing with Cleis. He knew very well that if the goddess of the waning moon descended in this city, everyone here would be doomed. He might be fine, but Metisha, Hippamera, and Lady Whitefog would not be spared, let alone Phoenix Fire and Mr. Liu. Thinking of this, he could not help but deeply believe that this was another conspiracy of Queen Madara. But Archbishop Philip did not turn his head and replied calmly, "It's not that bad, Count. The scene you saw earlier was us trying to find a way to seal the goddess, but there's not much time. Her Majesty the Queen will explain all this to you." "You can seal your goddess, the clone of the legendary Martha?" Brando asked sarcastically. "Clyce is not the clone of Lady Martha. That's just a rumor. Count, the undead believe in Martha only because we are the same as you, the people of order. We are not the same as you cold-blooded and heartless guys," Brando replied. "Did you plan all this from the beginning?" "Plan? What good does this do for us? You mean to make me believe that all this happened by chance? That's not entirely true." In the smoke, a somewhat hoarse voice suddenly replied. Brando frowned and looked up. He saw a woman's figure coming out of the smoke. He recognized at a glance that it was Queen Madara, but the latter was alone and seemed to be injured. She pressed her chest with one hand and supported herself against the wall with the other. She limped to the front of everyone. When she completely revealed herself from the smoke, Brando could not help but be stunned. Queen Madara was originally wearing a long black dress, but this dress was now in tatters. There was a long opening on one side like a cheongsam, revealing her snow-white thighs. But Brando was not in the mood to appreciate this scene, because Her Majesty the Queen's face was now covered in blood. Her face was hideous, and one of her eyes was closed. Blood kept flowing down her neck, chest and arms, causing the soaked dress to cling tightly to her body. Brando could not help but raise his eyebrows. "What's going on?" "I had a fight with Goddess Clyce," Her Majesty the Queen said in a hoarse voice, but she did not hide her words. "You had a fight with the goddess?" Brando asked in disbelief. "Only one blow. Not even one blow. With all due respect, even I am not sure if I can take a blow from a god." "Your Majesty, are you joking with me?" "No, this joke is not funny at all," Her Majesty the Queen replied coldly. "Clyce wanted to descend, but I blocked her with a sacrificial spell." "Sacrificial spell?" Brendel sucked in a breath of cold air. He suddenly remembered the believers and high-ranking priests in the undead moon temple. He stared at the two of them with his mouth agape, and finally understood the coldness and ruthlessness of the undead. Chapter 1335. With a clear shout, the battle between Huang Hua and the descendant of Clyce was finally over. The little girl's sword pierced through the shadow's forehead. She threw away the sword, took a step back and punched the shadow in the chest. Flames gushed out from her fist and instantly turned the monster into ashes. Amidst the monster's shrill scream, Huang Hua put away her sword and took 2 steps back. She gently exhaled and looked up. First, she looked at her hand strangely, then looked in the direction of Brando and the others. At this time, the dispute between Brando and Queen Madara had come to an end. The latter did not disappoint him and explained the whole story to him. First of all, she frankly admitted that she had known about the fall of Clyce a long time ago. That was before the battle between Madara's Grand Prince Hofentos and the Crystal Cluster. However, when the will of the goddess broke through the wall, it was not something she could decide. The reason why Brando and the others happened to bump into this matter was partly because of the coincidence, and partly because of Bai's deliberate arrangement. However, Brando felt that there was something wrong. According to what Huang Hua said, Bai should have known the whole story long ago. However, their encounter at Fathom Harbor was just a coincidence. At that time, the Dragon Queen had not launched her plan, and he had not gone to the elemental frontier. The will of the Twilight Dragon had not yet awakened in the Roman body, let alone invade this world. If that was the case, how could Bai have arranged everything in advance, not to mention the agreement between her and the Queen? However, Queen Madara only shook her head and told him that things were not as he thought. She said, "Although the Dragon Queen's plan had not entered the final stage at that time, don't forget that the plan of the tree herders is not a sudden idea. Their plan has been traceable for thousands of years. It may be difficult for others to come into contact with these things, but Bai is different. She is one of the 12 tree herders." "You mean Bai appeared at Fathom Harbor because she knew that I would go there and compete with her for the War Slate and the Pearl of Darkness? I thought you had a brain, Count," Queen Madara replied, rolling her eyes. Brando heard Delphian giggling behind him. He turned his head and looked at his troublesome think tank, but he still couldn't figure out what was wrong with his words. He knew that there were some abilities in Wone that could predict the future, but this ability was not as effective as what the astrologers claimed. The prediction of the future was more like a prediction of a trend. It was then revealed to the mortals through a hazy oracle, and then translated by a prophet. It was considered good if it was 20% or 30% credible. It might be able to predict the development and direction of things for a period of time, but it was basically impossible to accurately predict a person and where he would appear in the future. Even a god like Goddess Helene, who was in charge of fate, her function was only to reveal the fate of mortals, not to arrange and control their future. Legend had it that her sister, the thread manipulator Alice, had such an ability, but it was only a legend after all. Queen Madara saw that Howrin didn't understand, so she replied, "No one in this world can predict such things, not even God. But we don't need to predict these things." Don't need to? Brando was stunned for a moment, but he wasn't too stupid, at least in the eyes of Queen Madara. He finally understood. "You mean, Madame Bai wasn't after me in the first place?" "Nonsense," Queen Madara replied snappily. "Before that, we didn't even know who you were. Bai was there for the Dragon Queen's plan. In fact, the reason why Madara was there was because of the agreement between me and the Silver Queen." Brando thought for a moment and remembered that it seemed to be true. The rotten Nightcrot, who betrayed Madara, seemed to have told him the same thing. He believed that the small fry wouldn't dare to deceive him. However, Queen Madara's aggressive tone made him feel a little embarrassed, as if he was too self-righteous. But this was human nature. Everyone naturally put themselves in the shoes of others when considering a problem, especially when the matter was directly related to them. Fortunately, Delphian seemed to have finally remembered which side she was on. She smiled and helped Brando ask, "But Your Majesty, Ms. Bai's plan later changed. You probably didn't know about it, but you didn't seem surprised, did you? Otherwise, why did you not hesitate to give the Mercury staff to us?" Brando finally raised his head and looked at Queen Madara. Although he didn't want to admit it, he had to admit that the Prime Minister's daughter had asked the question he wanted to ask the most. Queen Madara glanced at Delphian before replying, "This has to do with my agreement with Bai. I'd like to hear more." "There's one thing you already know, Mr. Count. The plan of the Silver Queen and the Dragon Queen originated from the agreement between Odin and the four sages in the era of the War of the Holy Saints. As the Holy Ones, they were the ones who kept the agreement. Their goal was to complete the unfinished plan of the Dark Dragon. Whether this plan succeeds or not, we have to at least put it into practice, because we can't judge whether what we're doing now is right or wrong." Queen Madara raised her head and looked at him sarcastically. "Not everyone can be like you, firmly believing that what they have chosen is right, especially when this choice is related to the future of our world. Hasty self-adherence and stubbornness will only lead us to eternal damnation. Are you wiser than the divine people? Or are you more far-sighted than the gods? You've got one thing wrong, Your Majesty. What I insist on is not right but justice," Brando replied, shaking his head. "And it is precisely because there are so many meanings of right and justice that we should exercise the power it gives us with caution. We should let more people participate in it to make decisions and make judgments. I think this is what the gods want for our future." "I don't want to convince you, Mr. Count," Queen Madara replied. "But I hope you remember what I said earlier. It's not my original idea, but a principle. You should have heard from Bai about the various major organizations of the divine people, but you still don't understand how they work, do you?" Brando thought to himself that he had already heard about how the divine people were organized, but not from Bai, but from Lady Whitemist and Ovina. But he still nodded patiently. The power of the twilight is so strong. In the darkest of times, the gods had already foreseen their fall, and the end of the Golden Age. These great consciousnesses realized a problem. After they passed away, how could their successors not make mistakes? The sound of collapsing buildings came from afar. Dark clouds surged in the sky above the city of the dead. Occasionally, a bolt of lightning would streak across the sky, splitting into countless tiny branches and striking the ground. The lightning lit up the eyes of everyone present. Soon, the sound of people yelling to put out the fire came from afar. In the center of the city of the dead, in the most densely populated area of Madara, For a moment it looked no different from Rushta. But Queen Madara didn't seem to care about her kingdom, or what kind of disaster her people were suffering. She only calmly told a story from the past. Mr. Count, when the gods were still alive, when the divine people were at their most glorious days, our world would still make mistakes in the face of the twilight, let alone after they passed away. You only need to imagine, in the days when the great consciousnesses weren't protecting us, a small mistake could lead us to eternal damnation. Under such circumstances, Mother couldn't help but have such a thought. How could she let her children continue to fight against the Twilight Dragon after she left? Brando thought of the great consciousnesses and his heart wavered. She was the mother of all things. In the legends of the Pale poem, she did indeed have such a great heart. She was an omnipotent existence that surpassed all wills and wisdom. However, she had personally bestowed a spirit to this world and created her children. She had also sacrificed everything for them. For the creatures of Wonde, was there anything more noble than this? How did Mother do it? That's history from countless eons ago. Who could possibly know about it? But after that, the gods and the divine people agreed on a principle, and the arbiters I was thus established. Its duty was to supervise. This principle was that no matter what, no matter how big or small, as long as it could determine the future of our world and change the fate of our world, we must judge it with suspicion. No matter how right it seems on the surface or how crazy or absurd it is, as long as there is a possibility, we must be prepared. Countless years later, we don't know if this was Mother's decision. Queen Madara shook her head and said. But this decision led to many things. One of them was the split between the Truth Parliament and the World Tree. All for One and tree herders were born as a result, and this was one of the reasons for the arrival of the mortal era. The divine people argued and finally decided to follow this principle and split into two. Chapter 1336. The queen raised her head, and a purple light seemed to be reflected in the depths of her eyes. She replied softly, "That's why you see the descendants of the divine people, the gold and silver people, handing over their authority to the mortals. On the other hand, the tree herders are recreating the bloodline of the divine people. Even someone as arrogant as my father was hesitant in this plan, and he was eventually defeated by the four sages." Brando finally understood what was going on, but he still could not understand this logic. In a situation where their own strength was not enough to resist external aggression, it was ridiculous to divide their limited power. The queen turned her head and looked at Brando. "Do you find it difficult to understand, Count Brando? From the perspective of ordinary people, it is indeed so, but are the ancestors and the sages really that ignorant? The problem is that if we choose a wrong path, the more we advance on this path, the closer we are to destruction. We cannot judge whether we are right or wrong, so when one side chooses this path, the other side has the obligation to observe and evaluate how this plan will ultimately lead us to. At the same time, they have to be prepared to stop the whole plan at any time." This does sound a little ridiculous, but this ridiculousness is based on the confusion and uneasiness of our lowly selves, just because we can't see any hope. Think about it. Everyone is preparing for a war that is bound to be lost. We have to invest in many sides in order to carefully maintain the survival of this world. So I really envy you ignorant mortals. It is because of your ignorance that you can go on fearlessly. It is as if there will always be a sunrise tomorrow, and hope will always exist. But in reality, the sun has long been extinguished. Perhaps tomorrow it will never rise again. For those who know all this, this is a matter of despair, but they can't make it public. Just like a father and mother in a family, they have to support the family alone and protect their children. My father and my mother shoulder this responsibility, and I have been surrounded by this nightmare since the moment I was born. Count Brando, can you understand the feelings of a group of people like us?" Her Majesty the Queen stopped, then opened her mouth again and said, "Count Brando, I'm sorry to let you know these things. I didn't want to disturb your beautiful dream, but like I said, since you have chosen this path, you have to bear this responsibility." Brando let out a long sigh. He was silent for a long time, until an aftershock swept through the silent death sanctuary, and the ground trembled. A temple not far from here collapsed, and the sound of the building collapsing could still be heard clearly from hundreds of meters away. It was as if many descendants of Kleis had descended into this world. The sound of fighting came from the distance. It should be the Black Knight Regiment of the Undead attacking the temple. A shadow monster scuttled in from the corner. Brando reached out and grabbed its throat from dozens of meters away, crushing the monster into pieces. Queen Madara saw this scene, and the depths of her eyes lit up. This young count was only one step away from becoming a sage. That day on the battlefield of Finhotos, she gave him access to Tiamat, which seemed to be of great help to him. There is no such thing as a beautiful dream in this world. You think of mortals as too weak, Your Majesty. Brando opened his palm and replied indifferently, I was born in a remote village in Erewhon, so remote that you might not have heard of the name of this place before you planned to invade this kingdom. But before I came of age, I lived in the shadow of your army. Perhaps I was carefree when I was young, but I could feel the fear and hatred of the undead in the eyes of the people around me. Ever since the Bloodstaff swept through eastern Karsuk, do you know how many years the people of Erewhon have succumbed to the coldness and majesty of the Mercury Staff? Ever since the War of the Black Rose, do you know how many Butchie people have been displaced and how many people have lost their families in this war? For the fathers of those children, the husbands of those wives, dying in this final war is no different from dying under the butcher's knife of your army. The despair and fear in their hearts is no different. In those dark days, everyone had to struggle to survive. Where is their hope? Brando turned his head and looked at Her Majesty. Just like the king of the mortal world, who has to be careful of a sharp blade at all times, or be killed by a cup of poisoned wine, the farmers of the mortal world have to be constantly worried about their harvest in the coming year. There are also wars and all kinds of man-made disasters. In this world where we can only survive with difficulty, who can be independent? I express my regret for your experience, Your Majesty. Although I also admire Lord Odin, this does not mean that we are weak people. Yes, I am just a mortal lord. Even if in the eyes of the farmers in my territory, I may be high and mighty, but in your eyes, I may not be any different from them. Everyone is more or less arrogant and prideful, and occasionally I have such thoughts. Brando took out a handkerchief from his pocket and unfolded it. We don't know much. The legends of the past are as distant as myths to us. We don't know that there are people in this world who bear a lot of things and are fighting for us like Miss Andrea and Lord Odin. They are the most noble people in this world, but... He handed the handkerchief to Queen Madara. It's no different for us. It's not as complicated as you think. It's just a war. Anyone can die in this war, including me and you. But at least I can promise you one thing. I will definitely die before you, Your Majesty. Wipe your face. Queen Madara looked at the white handkerchief in Brando's hand, and then looked up at Brando. His face was serious and serious. You're right. The sun may not rise tomorrow, and our world may be destroyed in the very next moment. But there's nothing to worry about. I'm prepared to fight and die for it. As long as there are no regrets, it's not as terrible as imagined, is it not? Queen Madara hesitated for a moment and silently took the handkerchief from his hand. But she did not move. She just clenched the handkerchief tightly. Well, Brando looked at the queen and replied, I believe what you said is true. But now it is your turn to make me believe, Your Majesty. About my plan with White? About everything. Her Majesty frowned as Philip stood beside her. She hesitated for a while before replying, just like the principle I told you before, the agreement between Odin and the four sages. If there is an executor, there will naturally be an overseer, and I am that overseer. This plan was not born in a day. It has existed for a long time. My father, Odin, represented the will of the Truth Parliament. In fact, it was a continuation of the era of the gods. The powerful Myrna Empire ruled the world with the power of the gold and silver people to resist the Twilight Dragon. And the Tree Herders' plan went one step further, to recreate the gods and return to the era of the gods. After the outbreak of the War of the Holy Saints, because of the agreement between the gods and the gods, my father did not want to cut off the hope of the mortals. So he eventually failed. But he made a promise with the mortals and the Tree Herders, and that was the gamble 1,000 years later. Still because of that principle, Queen Madara nodded. The reason why it had to wait 1,000 years was because my father wanted to give the mortals a chance to reproduce. They were too weak at that time. My father revealed part of the past and future to the four sages. After understanding Won's fate, the sages agreed to this agreement. As the one who fulfilled the agreement, Eloranta chose to become the holy saint. And Gretel left his holy sword and brought it out of Cruz. Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress, turned into a heroic spirit. She glanced at Brando. You received the inheritance of Saint Tossel, right? If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Count. Brando was shocked. This was the first time someone saw through his secret, but he did not deny it. He just nodded silently. Fanzan should also have left something behind. But this sage of the four sages has always been a man of few words. We have no way of knowing what he left behind. I heard that in the last days of his life he seemed to have seen something. Some people said that he left this world and went to a distant place, but I don't know if it's true. Hearing this, Brando understood most of it. He said, So you and Haku already knew about the Dragon Queen's plan, but you didn't stop her. You just made some preparations outside of this plan. Is that right? Yes, because I have to represent the other side of this principle. When the Dragon Queen's plan failed, I had to ensure the feasibility of another plan. What plan? I don't know. This plan was born out of the establishment of Wond when he was still a mortal. Wond's mortal was first proposed by the Truth Symposium, but the Truth Symposium eventually split because of this. I only know its name. It's called the Wond Plan. The Wond Plan. Brando's memory fragments seemed to be floating in his mind, like sparks of fire. The second half of this plan was actually out of the control of the gods. Another great will took over, but it didn't leave a name. I think it might be Martha, but it could also be another god. Because this plan was carried out in secret, even its executors didn't understand what it meant. Because of this, it was placed after all the other plans. Even my parents only left a glimmer of hope for it according to the oracle. This glimmer of hope was the Roman, your merchant lady. What? So do you understand now? It is because of the existence of that great will that the Twilight Dragon's mortal body, that is, your fiancé, was not killed. An oracle was sent down at the last moment, allowing the Truth Symposium to pass a resolution to preserve her until the generation of my father and mother. But why? As I said, I don't know. It's only related to a promise left by Martha. Mother left a hope for all of us. Brando raised Oderfeis in his hand. Is this all? That's all, Madara replied. That's why White went to the Metz region, other than to fulfill his promise to keep an eye on the Dragon Queen and the White Queen's plan. He was also looking for the legendary Orb of Darkness that was lost in the eastern Metz region. She looked at the handkerchief in her hand, picked it up, and gently wiped the blood on her face. So because of the Dragon Queen's plan, she will definitely go out of the elemental domain. For us watchers, we will only calculate the failure of the plan, and not what will happen if it succeeds. But as for why we met you, Mr. Count, perhaps this is the hope that Lady Martha left for us. Because this is our destiny. Chapter 1337. The earth hummed in resonance, and a long streak of lightning formed a distant scene in the dark sky. After the War of the Fifth Era, the gods began to leave our world. The last to leave was Martha. This was the twilight of the gods. This was the prophecy of the gods. They passed this world to the descendants of the gods, and when the blood of the gods that flowed on the earth became thinner and thinner, one day, the generation of gold and silver would replace them. After the age of silver, the age of black iron would come. In the Truth Parliament, the descendants of the divine people found a child with a pure bloodline in the depths of Gaia's will in order to revive the glorious era. When this child was chosen by the will of Dusk, Dusk hoped to use her to steal the same level of authority as Marcia. It projected a part of its will into our world and merged with the child's soul. When it came, it was discovered by the will. Our plan began to take shape from that era. The child survived and was passed down from generation to generation until my parents met with an accident. My father and the four sages agreed on everything 1,000 years later, but they hid the existence of the child. 1,000 years later, on the final battlefield, your grandfather found her again. You already know everything that happened after that. When the Dragon Queen's plan failed, the will of the Twilight Dragon awakened in our world. With the blood of the ancestors, it seized the authority of our world. It found the place where the gods died and brought them back from the void. But what it brought back was no longer the great will that cared for us and protected us, but the will of chaos, puppets, and empty shells that were controlled by the Twilight Dragon. Just yesterday, the stars of Wonde had been extinguished forever, replaced by the rising constellation of the dragon god Bahamut. After tens of thousands of years, it shone again in the sky of Wonde. The gods have returned, but what they brought was not glory and hope, but cold and lifeless despair. Madara put down her handkerchief and replied coldly. The white handkerchief was stained with blood. This is blasphemy. Andrea couldn't help but shout. Although she was the one who suggested this possibility to Brando, when she heard the truth, as a member of the Earth Legion and the most devout warrior of the gods and their people, she couldn't help but lose control of her emotions. In fact, Mr. Liu and the others were also in disbelief. They knew even less about the inside story of Twilight Descent. Although they had gradually learned some things along the way, they had never been so straightforward and shocking. Everyone was silent. Huang He took 2 steps and stopped. He looked at his teacher worriedly. How are the dragons? For some reason, Allah's figure appeared in front of Brando's eyes. That willful little female dragon. Just like when they parted ways in Ampere Seal. Her golden curly hair was shining, and her eyes were full of slyness. But after a while, another girl who was even quieter appeared in his mind. She had long snow-white hair and wore a pair of teardrop-shaped earrings. She was frowning and glaring at him. Humans, you're shameless. Brando's heart suddenly felt empty. After a moment of silence, he let out a long sigh. The dragons have no future, Queen Madara replied. They may still be able to survive, but without the protection of the dragon god, their bloodline will soon become thin, and no new dragons will be born. Perhaps in 1,000 years, the mortals will see the last dragon in this world close its eyes. Of course, if we can wait until that day. So in the end, what is your countermeasure? Yes, in my opinion, we still have 2 ways. Queen Madara looked at him, a deep light flashing in the depths of her purple eyes. One way is to restart this world just like what the gods did in the past. Although the Twilight Dragon has seized power, we also have a new Martha. The Twilight Dragon was sealed by the Holy One, and is one of the 3 remaining supreme authorities. As long as you and Ekis agree, we will start again. But it is foreseeable that in the next era, our power will be even weaker. Not to mention, Ekis' power will be unstoppable. Mortals may be enslaved by it, but at least the civilization can continue to pass on. Ekis came to see me, Brando replied. She said this to me, but I will not agree. I will not agree to this path. Then there is only one other way. In the prophecy, a great king will come to our world. He will open Martha's treasury and guide his people. The will of the gods will crown him in the clouds. At that moment, the whole Wonde will sing for him. He will defeat the Twilight Dragon, and our world will usher in an incomparably bright future. Brando looked at Queen Madara, and their eyes met in midair. The will of the master of the Mercury staff was firm and unshakable. Brando's eyes were also calm, as if thousands of years had passed in his eyes. At this moment he saw history, the present, and the future at the same time. But there was only one answer. And that answer he had already decided. If it were you, Your Majesty, what would you choose? Just like your father? No, now the world depends on your choice, Count. Brando sighed and shook his head. You have already decided? I have already decided, haven't I, Your Majesty? At this moment, many people in this world are also making their own decisions. These decisions may not be important to Wonde, but in the end, they will change the course of history. Queen Madara thought of Brando's words, but she was obviously not satisfied with the answer. Wonde needed a king, not a brave warrior. Don't talk big, she said, thinking of her father. I know your determination and will, but your death will not help this world. What we need is not faith and ideals, but the strength to resist the Twilight Dragon. But if we do not have faith and ideals, and if the civilized world does not have order and compassion for the weak, even if we defeat the Twilight Dragon, what difference will there be between our world and chaos? Don't change the topic, Your Majesty. The problem now is that we have no way to defeat the Twilight Dragon. The Queen's tone began to contain anger. Your Majesty, Brando's tone was very gentle. If I am the supreme monarch you speak of like your father in your memory, perhaps one day this world will defeat the Twilight Dragon under my rule, but in the next era, it will face the same predicament as us. Do the people in every era have to hope for a savior to save them? This is the so-called era of mortals? Your Majesty, Brando sighed. Do not forget, as long as order is not destroyed, the Twilight Dragon will not die. 1,000 years ago, your father used his death to prove this cycle. What happened to the kingdom founded by the 4 wise men? The title of the Fool is a heavy honorific because it tells us that what we need is not only the wise men who created an era. He shook his head. I think we have made a lot of mistakes in the past. In the future I see people no longer need the wise men and nobles, nor do they need the divine people and the gods. In that era the gods are no longer and the heroes are gone. Mortals will move forward by themselves, opening a difficult path in the thorns and darkness. Perhaps that era will be very humble, and order will be like a weak candle flame in the long night. But at least the road ahead will not be the Twilight Dragon, but the dawn, and hope will be eternal. It sounds wonderful, but what about the Twilight Dragon? Brando was silent for a moment. His eyes flashed with a strange light, as if he had seen everything he had seen in the elemental frontier. He saw Miss Tada and the Holy Ones looking at him expectantly. He saw Lord Saint Tossel nodding gently at him. He even saw the majestic figure, his grandfather, Earthsword Saint Darius. The old man did not say a word. He just turned around silently, bent down to pick up his sword from the ground, and left Brendel with a silent back view. There was something in his eyes that was not there before. It was as if after he got the answer, he only had the determination to move forward. I promise all of you, Brendel enunciated each word clearly to the Madara Queen and everyone present. Everything that I see will come true. Queen Madara wanted to refute, but when she saw Brendel's expression, the words that were about to come out of her mouth lost their strength and became pale. She silently shut her mouth. I promise you, Sophie. Everything will be fine. In the darkness, 2 tall figures turned around and resolutely walked out of the hall. There, the Myrna Imperial Guard stood still. In the army, Kelsey and Tumen were waiting. I believe in you, teacher. A somewhat young voice replied. Huang He walked to Brando's side. She held her sword in her hand and answered without any doubt. I believe in you too, my lord. Andrea whispered behind Brando. I have seen the darkest times. The battles seemed to be endless. We won again and again, but the hope was getting slimmer and slimmer. Finally you are back. I believe that you must be the one to bring us hope. Mr. Liu and Philip did not speak. One of them did not understand what she said, and the other seemed to be indifferent to all of this. Delphian frowned and remained silent, as if she was thinking about something. Only Fang Qi was beaming with joy. No one knew what he was excited about. Chapter 1338. Queen Madara took a deep breath and said, Well, if this is the path you have chosen, I hope you won't regret it. You are the master recognized by the holy swords, the one promised by Martha. I don't know if it's right or wrong to give you the Mercury staff, but I respect your choice. She paused for a moment before continuing, but no matter what you want to do, you must get the 7 holy swords. Now I'll tell you where the orb of nature is. Brando held his breath. In fact, when he saw Fang Qi and Phoenix Flame, he had already guessed the purpose of the Queen's summons. After all, she had sent Insursta and Tarkus to Rosaline to contact the Ghost Chariot, which meant that Madara should have already known the existence of the mystery of the Emerald. But before that, I have something to tell you. Her Majesty's tone became cold again. She gently threw the handkerchief on the ground. Oenlos is dead, Bahamut should have come to the world, and the gods everywhere will come one after another. In addition, although the will of the Twilight is temporarily sealed, its claws and teeth have begun to attack. For us, war has already come, so whether you are willing to bear this responsibility or not, the whole civilized world must unite to fight, or we will not have another chance. Brando glanced at her unhappily. But at this time, the undead of Madara are invading Erewhon and fighting the wind elves of Saint Tossel. No, now Erewhon no longer has my army, you should understand this. What's more, the so-called War of the Black Roses broke out because of something else. I will tell you the reason sooner or later. And who told you that we are fighting the wind elves? You are not fighting Saint Tossel. Are we crazy? Brando was taken aback. In history, Madara fought Erewhon and Saint Tossel at the same time in the Second War of the Black Roses, and Erewhon was not the main battlefield of the Second War of the Black Roses. It was not as deadly to the kingdom as the later Battle of the Oblique Forest and the Battle of Cipher. In fact, the Second War of the Black Roses in history referred to the war between the undead and the Wind Elves. Although the undead did not have much of an advantage in that war, Queen Madara used it to consolidate her authority and consume the forces that opposed her in the empire. But he only froze for a moment before he realized that his thoughts were somewhat bound by the history of the Amber Sword. In history, although Madara might also be at war with the Crystal Cluster, it was not as urgent as it was now. After all, in the game, Vaunt had steadily transitioned to the middle of the Second Era. Although it had experienced the Slate War and the Calamity of Wolves, it did not look like it was on the verge of collapse at that time. Under such circumstances, it was unlikely that Madara would divide her forces to deal with Saint Tossel. But he was a little speechless. Why was the owner of the Mercury Staff so obsessed with Erwin? Why would she start a war for him when she was under attack from both sides? After all, the First War of the Black Roses could be explained as a war for her to establish her authority, but the Second War of the Black Roses had no meaning, especially when the undead did not attack the Wind Elves of Saint Tossel. Brando really could not see any strategic intentions. In that case, Your Majesty, what do you plan to do? We must ensure that before you find the 7 keys, this world will not fall. And the seal of the Twilight Dragon is our last chance. But this time the will to protect this world is no longer there, and even the gods are standing on the opposite side of us. Only the mortal world is left. To be honest, I don't know if our desperate gamble will succeed. If there is no other choice, we have to ask Ekis for help. Brando shook his head. That was not what he wanted, but he already understood what the Queen meant. So, the world of order needs an alliance that can connect the people of Erwin, the people of Cruz, the people of Fanzan, and the Wind Elves, the 4 holy temples, and all the intelligent races in this world. Just like the Sacred Covenant 1,000 years ago, the mortals will once again fight for their own destiny. Queen Madara nodded slowly. She replied, although this is far from what I originally envisioned, this is the only way. Fanzan and Eloranta have already formed an alliance, and Saint Tossel's attitude is unclear. Between the 4 of us, we need a middle force to connect them. I originally hoped that the people of Cruz could block the will of the Twilight Dragon, and then the Silver Folk would call for this alliance. Unfortunately, the people of Cruz have lost this opportunity, and the Silver Folk will soon face their own troubles. But your proposal reminds me that maybe you are a better choice. Us? You want the people of Erwin to lead this alliance? Delphian suddenly reacted and asked in disbelief. Brando immediately reacted. The Queen's intention was still on him. But this time, he pondered for a moment and did not object. He only asked, what should we do? Queen Madara was slightly stunned, as if the prepared speech did not come in handy. Do you think I will object? Brando saw the look on the Queen's face. The Queen looked at him with her purple eyes, and after a long while she replied, you should understand that an alliance is not the best choice, and the best way to integrate the power of the civilized world is an empire. And everyone will support you, the descendants of Fanzan, Gretel, Saint Tossel, and Eloranta. They will not oppose you because you are the chosen one of this world. Martha, our mother, will personally crown you. Brando smiled. The world of civilization and order will stand together, just as described in the Sacred Covenant. Your Majesty, if people need a flag, I will stand in front of everyone. This is my responsibility, but it is not to decide their fate in life and death. Do people really need a high and mighty monarch? Queen Madara was speechless. Let's not talk about this first, but I want to hear your thoughts, Your Majesty. The Queen hesitated for a moment before replying. It's actually very simple. I hope that the civilized world will believe in us. I will let the undead army pass through their land and join their camp. Resist the army of Dusk in the Alkash Mountains. This is our only chance. Brando gasped. Resist the army of Dusk in the Alkash Mountains? What about the Sea of the Dying Moon? Are you planning to give up the Sea of the Dying Moon? Kleis will descend on this land. Without the protection of the goddess of the Dying Moon, this land will no longer mean anything to us. Perhaps one day we will return, but that will be after we have won. The Great Migration of the Undead. This phrase flashed through Brando's mind. He thought for a moment. Erwin's people had to act as Madara's envoys to persuade the various countries. This was not easy to accomplish, and the time given to them was limited. However, The master of the Mercury staff had stopped invading Erewhon at the last moment. Perhaps this, coupled with the performance of Erewhon's people, would more or less gain some trust in the countries of the living, but overall it was still not optimistic. And Brando knew very well that even Erewhon's people themselves might not be able to accept Madara's kindness. Hundreds of years of being blinded by hatred was not something that could be changed overnight. Besides, he could not lead all of this himself. All of this had to be handed over to Princess Griffine and Haruz, and perhaps the eldest son of the king. He hoped that they could persuade Erewhon's people to take on this responsibility. Thinking of this, he asked, "Do I have time to go back to Erewhon?" The Queen of Madara shook her head. "Not so much time. This is why I asked you to summon your goddess of war. You must find the nature's orb before Kleist descends." "But Freya just left. Can't Metisha and Hipamra do the job? Fuchsia wants to take them away. Can you persuade her?" Brando did not say anything. Putting aside whether he could persuade the Seven-Pole Dragon King, he could see that Metisha and Hipamra wanted to become stronger. At this time he had to respect their choice. "Don't worry, we still have some time. After Kleist was defeated by us, she will not come again for a while. Although this time is not enough for you to go back to Erewhon to arrange everything, at least you can wait until your goddess of war arrives. I have asked the Holy Sanctum to build a portal that can send you to the center of the Sea of the Dying Moon. But this portal is one way. After you leave, we will also leave this place. I will bring your followers with me, and then we will meet in Algash. If we can meet again." Brando knew that a long-distance portal could not be built overnight. Obviously, Her Majesty had been preparing for this for a long time. Queen Madara knew what he was thinking and replied, "The undead have a detailed record of the mystery of the emerald. I have always known that it is in the center of the Sea of the Dying Moon. But to open it, you need the blood of the 9 Phoenix royal family. As for how to persuade your student and that guy," she raised her chin and signaled to Fang Qi, "then you will have to rely on yourself. The people of the 9 Phoenix will not back down at this time. We will join this sacred covenant." Huang He finally found a chance to speak. "I will also help my teacher." As she spoke, she looked at Mr. Liu, who nodded slightly at her. "This is the price of the sacred jade sword." Fang Qi thought for a moment and said, "If I am not wrong, Mr. Count, you have been plotting against me for a long time, right?" Brando looked at him, but the latter looked at Delphian and said, "If? Mr. Fang Qi, please respect yourself." The Prime Minister's daughter replied coldly. Fang Qi scratched his head and shrugged. Brando thought for a moment and asked, "I have another question, Your Majesty. You said that Owenlos has fallen. I want to ask what happened to the Cruz Empire and what happened to the dragon?" "It's just a fiasco," Madara replied coldly. "The Dusk's minions have opened a hole in the Kurlutz Empire, and from there, they will be able to take advantage of the situation and head south. The Farnezans and Atlanta's elves are fighting against the Nose army in the Great Glacier. The Kurlutz and the dragons have already lost, and the Bugas can't even take care of themselves. The Wind Elves alone won't be able to stop the Dusk's army, so my army and I must enter the Alkash Mountains before that." "The Bugas can't take care of themselves?" Brando was stunned for a moment, then suddenly reacted. "The Slate War broke out." "The Slate War?" Queen Madara looked at him suspiciously. "You seem to know something?" Brando realized that he had said something wrong and quickly corrected himself. "You let Tariq go to Alkash before that because of this reason?" "Not only that, Her Majesty fell into his trap. Of course, it was more likely that she didn't care in the first place. Perhaps when you see Yalvit, you will understand why. She and Tariq met someone there, and now she is in Erewhon with your men." "Humph. I already knew that this woman has been looking for the whereabouts of Valhalla." Chapter 1340. In the twilight forest outside the land of everlasting death, the dark river was shrouded in thick fog. The sound of flowing water could be heard as the waves passed through the rocks in the river and formed a whirlpool. The twigs and driftwood that flowed down from the upper reaches of the river swirled and sank to the bottom of the river. Occasionally, 1 or 2 white lines could be seen in the dark night. A battle was taking place on the riverbank. March of the Unending Army. Fuchsia was like a lone peak in the forest. A card glowing with black light was spinning on its 7th horn. When it finally stopped, it revealed the scene of an army of spectral mercenaries marching across the dark plains. Countless skeletons were crawling out from the ground. Mud was peeling off from their bodies, revealing their white skeletons. These filthy evil spirits stood up shakily from the riverbank. From afar, a terrifying phosphorescence could be seen surging towards the other side of the battlefield. Medisha and Hippamera. Heaven's armor! The silver elf princess also threw out a card. She stretched out her hand, and the card instantly hung in midair. Silver light gathered, as if the light of the world was added to it. On the surface of the card above the holy clouds, a beam of light pierced down like a sharp sword. Just as the card described, when the light of judgment plows through the battlefield, the undead army will be reduced to ashes. The planeswalker's power resonated with the entire world. The three of them looked up and saw a golden cloud suddenly appear in the dark night sky. Above the cloud there was a light that no one could look at. The light shone into the forest and covered the riverbank. Holy flames immediately ignited on the riverbank, and the undead howled and melted in the flames, turning into ashes. It was as if judgment had descended upon the world. Fuchsia nodded. A hint of cunning flashed in her golden eyes. She spoke. The 5 colors of dawn can be transformed into any color. It can be used in many different ways in a battle based on the cards of fate that I have. In this battle, I will use the agile and reckless red creatures to attack you. The red creatures are easily angered and weak. Once their attacks are thwarted, they will leave a large number of corpses in the graveyard. The unending army can transform all the creatures in the graveyard into level 10 black spectral mercenaries. They may look weak in your eyes, but a planeswalker's power is not only limited to creatures and spells. Her voice rumbled in the forest and startled a flock of birds. They flapped their wings and flew into the night sky. But she did not seem to hear anything. She raised her golden claw and showed the next card. Vengeance. Balls of white light rose from the ashes of the undead creatures. They looked like ghostly flames in the dark. Fuchsia pointed her claw at Medisha. Countless balls of light flew towards Medisha. The silver elf princess could not dodge in time and was hit in the chest. Blood spurted out of her mouth as she was sent flying. Miss Priestess screamed in fright and rushed over to help Medisa up. Hippamera, I'm fine. Medisha's face was pale. Blood was dripping from the corner of her mouth. It took her a long time to catch her breath. She forced a smile that looked worse than crying and replied weakly. She let out a sigh and looked at Wuxia from afar. I lost again, Your Majesty. That's normal. I inherited my planeswalker powers from the same era as Odin, Tumen, and Kelsey. It would be ridiculous if I couldn't even defeat 2 planeswalkers. But do you know why you lost, little princess? Fuchsia replied. Medisha shook her head. Your cards have powerful spells and excellent creatures, and they complement each other. Every card can be considered powerful, but this is far from enough because the power of a planeswalker is not built on a few powerful cards. You are a knight. Do you understand your position in your master's deck? Knight? What is a knight, little princess? Fuchsia raised her head. Her golden eyes were like 2 full moons in the night sky. Her voice echoed throughout the forest. A knight is a noble of the border. You are the minister of the king. You are the leader of your subjects. You are the lord, the soldier, and the ruler. Every time the king blows his horn and summons you to fight for him, you must raise your flag, mount your war horse, and fight for honor. So this is my role in the Lord's all-class system. Medisha suddenly understood. Her silver eyes shone brightly. That's right. Your position in the full-time card dominator group is a solid supporter, and the white color that Brendel set for you is suitable for you. White is the color of justice, and in the world of planeswalkers, it symbolizes law, order, and organization. White mana is contained in the planes. It symbolizes wealth and prosperity. White cards have excellent and cheap soldiers, monks, and angels. It symbolizes honor and loyalty. So as the king's knight, you must repay your planeswalker with self-discipline, wealth, loyalty, and honor. You are the cornerstone of this system. The prosperity of the knight deck symbolizes the prosperity of the kingdom. Only with endless wealth can the other decks become richer. Your self-discipline and loyalty can awaken the creatures on the battlefield. You use your honor to lead them to fight for the king. So the most suitable deck for you is the pure white barrier deck. Medisa had a pensive look on her face. What about me, Your Majesty Dragon King? Hippamera asked quickly. She looked at the cleric. Gray represents stability, determination, and protection. Gray cards are strong in defense but weak in attack. It is slightly cumbersome. Although you are the cleric of Himalud, you don't have to restrict yourself to a fixed way of thinking. I will send you to the Temple of Yahweh Island. There is a long-lost mountain sanctuary there. Before the year of eradication, the clerics there faced the power of the raging sea every day. You will understand the fusion of the earth and the sea there and learn to use the gray and blue control deck. When do we leave? Medisha suddenly asked. She raised her head and stared at the dark sky with her golden eyes. Ever since the necropolis of Waning Moon 3 days ago, the fire had never been extinguished. The sky was dyed red by the flames as if it was the end of the world. 1 week later. How long will the trial take, Your Majesty Dragon King? Not too long. The trial will be completed in the realm of time of the people of Mauritania. The long time there is only a moment in the prime material plane. You will be able to complete the trial in half a month at most if you can come out alive. Medisha's eyes lit up. Can we leave earlier? Earlier? How much earlier? Now immediately. She frowned slightly and said, I have to remind you that the trial of the planeswalker is very dangerous. You better be well prepared. Medisha turned around and looked at Hipamra. Both of them nodded at the same time. We have thought about it, Your Majesty Dragon King. For the past 3 days, the city of everlasting death was shrouded in shadows. Flames were burning in the city near and far. Golden smoke billowed into the sky, reflecting the night sky red. 3 days ago, the goddess of Waning Moon's scheme was thwarted, but she still left an indelible scar on the city. After the Temple of Waning Moon collapsed, a bottomless abyss replaced its original location. This abyss stretched across the center of the city. Countless children of the evil god were crawling out from the abyss. The necromancers had to do their best to suppress them in the center of the city. A believer of the Waning Moon walked through the hall and shouted to the balcony, Mr. Brando, your guest. Brendel and Delphine were talking on a balcony, and Andrea was standing by the side. This scene under the night sky was reflected in the eyes of the three of them. He turned around and saw a familiar figure appear in front of him. Brando. Freya was travel-worn. The tiredness on her face seemed to have been swept away. She had just dismounted from the back of the wyvern. Ever since she received the princess's order, she rushed here from Ranner without rest. Everything she saw and heard these days was like a dream. She could not believe the words of the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, but the fact that the undead signed the peace agreement, withdrew from Erewhon, returned Butchie, and punished the war criminals was an ironclad fact. All of this was because of the man in front of her. It was rumored that he, together with the 9 Phoenix Alliance and the Silver Elves, defeated the undead empire in the south of the Sea of Waning Moon. Although the details were not detailed, the Black Rose of the Roman Empire had made concessions. If it wasn't for that heart-wrenching victory, the Emperor of Madara wouldn't have bowed down so easily. Others might not be able to do it, but she firmly believed that if it was that person, then he would definitely be able to do it. Because this was not the first time she witnessed him creating miracles. She still remembered the battle of life and death in Fortress Reden. If it was not for that life and death battle, if it was not for Brando, she would not be where she was today. The Valkyrie of Aween that was praised by the people. Freya remembered the light brown eyes that shone with unwavering hope. The chestnut-colored hair, the familiar face, appeared in front of her again. She smiled at her and said, Freya. P.S. After organizing my thoughts, I'm back. I'll update 1 chapter today, and I'll resume tomorrow. The main thing was that I spent some time thinking about Brando's Planeswalker cards. I definitely did not pick up trash or anything like that. Speaking of which, I've been really unlucky this month. I can't even drink water. Not only did I catch a cold some time ago, I even applied for a new bank card last week, but I forgot to tell my editor. As a result, I have to eat dirt this month. Chapter 1341. In the hall, a flight of 47 steps connected the balcony to the hall. A scarlet carpet was laid out from the top to the bottom. The portrait of the 17th High Priest of the Waning Moon Temple, the Eerie Edward, was hung on the walkway. He was thin and held a staff in one hand. Brando and Freya stood on the balcony, one in the hall, the other in the balcony. Their gazes passed through the length of the stairs and made eye contact. Freya took a deep breath. She seemed to have had a dream. This dream started from Bucci to Fortress Reeden to Braggs to the Royal Knight Academy to Ampere Seal to Ranner to the battlefield of Manowar, and then here. The scene in the dream changed until now. Brando, am I dreaming? I'm standing here. This is the capital of Madara. Did you really do it? Just as you promised us, Bucci has returned to Erewhon. The village has been rebuilt, and everyone has returned to their homeland. We followed the path that we escaped from that day and returned to the embrace of the Pine Mountains. That nightmare of Madara, is it really over? Brando lowered his head to look at the young girl who had tied her light brown hair into a ponytail at the back of her head. Her long ponytail had been cut short after the Battle of Ampere Seal, leaving only the part that reached her shoulders. The shaved hair was placed on the snow-white tombs of the Holy City, together with the withered Erewhon lilies. Freya's eyes were brighter than they were in that era. She was more confident and determined, like a shining brown gemstone. Her pair of heroic eyebrows were raised high. There was no confusion, weakness, hesitation, or the deep fatigue that he remembered most deeply. She wore a well-tailored knight's uniform, a dark blue jacket and snow-white breeches. Her chest was pinned with the black pine medal and the candlelight medal. A vulture's tail drooped down from her shoulder, commemorating the glory of the Battle of Ampere Seal. It was a symbol of the veterans of the White Lion Legion. Erewhon's Valkyrie stood upright. Although she was travel-worn, her sword, belt, armor, and accessories were all new and tidy. Only her boots were stained with some dust from the ashes of the city. When she got off her horse, she inevitably passed through a few streets that had turned into ashes. After 2 years of war and experience, the ignorant country girl seemed to have found the footprints in history and grew up. Two unrelated figures gradually overlapped at this moment, and became one. You're not dreaming, Freya. The war is over. Although it was out of my expectations, those who deserve to be punished have all gone to hell. From now on, the war between Awin and the undead is a thing of the past. Brando sighed and replied. For this answer, Erewhon's people had sacrificed too much, and he had also sacrificed too much. Compared to the blood feud in his previous life, this ending was somewhat unexpected. He also never dreamed that he would one day sit together with his sworn enemy and discuss the future of the kingdom and the world. But sometimes fate was just so bizarre. But how can that be in the past? Freya replied with some difficulty for a moment. She gripped her sword tightly. So many people died, and all we got was a treaty. Madara should pay the price. In Erewhon's country, the nobles controlled by the royal faction also questioned the princess and the parliament. There, she and the princess stood firmly on Brando's side, protecting his honor and authority. But here, as the most ordinary person in Erewhon, Freya could not help but ask this question. It was a hatred that had been rooted for hundreds of years, buried in the hearts of everyone who had been deeply hurt by it. At this moment, she was not Erewhon's Valkyrie, not the princess's knight, and not the commander of the White Lion Guards. She was just the girl who had escaped from Bucci. That night, the flames of Bucci burned fiercely, and her loved ones who had perished in the sea of fire. It was as if they were standing behind Freya. Then what do you want? Brando seemed to be able to feel the sorrow in Freya's heart. He said, Freya, if it's your wish, I'll fulfill all of your wishes. Even if it means destroying 2 countries and an entire world, I won't pay any price. Delphian stood behind Brando. She was about to say something, but when she heard this, she was so shocked that her expression changed. It was as if she had met Brando for the first time. She looked between the two of them. Andrea, on the other hand, looked at Freya with interest. The moment she saw Freya, she knew that this was the person she was looking for. The most important bloodline of the goddess of war's guards that was lost in the mortal world. Freya opened her mouth. What did she want? War? Revenge? No matter the cost, even if it meant dying together, she wanted Madara to pay the price? This was a 100-year-old hatred that could only be washed away with blood and fire? Freya looked into Brando's eyes. She thought that Brando was warning her, but she realized from his unwavering eyes that Brando was serious. As long as she asked, he would definitely start a war for her. From then on, Madara and Erewhon would fight to the death. Why? Freya trembled deeply. She suddenly remembered many things. The 3 of them walked side by side in the darkness and defeated the golden demonic tree together. They fought their way out of a hopeless situation. Do you still remember the promise I made to you and the Roman in Bragg's, Freya? I remember. Brando's heart suddenly ached. Out of the 3 people who fought side by side in Fortress Reden, one of them was no longer by their side. Do you understand now, Freya? He shook his head and sighed. I once promised you and the Roman that I will fulfill your wishes. No matter how dangerous the road ahead is, no matter how much time has passed, this promise is still valid. Freya's heart was warm, but when she saw Brendel's gloomy expression, she could not help but feel a lump in her throat. Amandina and Seal had already told her everything that had happened in Rusta. No, we will definitely save Roman, right? Brendel's eyes were filled with tears. Of course. Brando nodded. He had no doubts about this. That's enough, Brando. I don't have any other requests, I just can't accept it. I can't accept it. After all, we have suffered so many disasters. We can't accept that the culprit who caused all these tragedies can easily shirk responsibility. Freya said in a small voice. I understand that Erwin gained a lot from this victory. But compared to what we have suffered, compared to the Romans' Black Rose, did the undead really learn their lesson? She raised her head and said loudly, I just don't want our forgiveness to become a reason for them to continue their evil deeds. Then what do you want, little girl? A voice suddenly spoke in the darkness. Everyone in the hall was shocked and raised their heads. Freya did not realize who was talking to her. She just replied subconsciously, If it's possible, I really want to see Her Majesty the Queen. You will see her. The voice said, Who's talking so sneakily over there? Freya finally reacted. She frowned and shouted at the darkness in that direction. I'm not sneaking around. In this land there is no need for me to be sneaky. The voice replied arrogantly. As it spoke, it walked out from the darkness. Because of my name, my power, I am the supreme master of this land. Queen Madara was dressed in a black evening dress. Beside her were 2 black knights. She walked out from the shadows and looked at everyone in the hall arrogantly. Who are you? Freya had already guessed the identity of the person who came, but she could not help but ask. As you can see, I am the person you want to see. Queen Madara replied coldly. Now I am in front of you, the envoy of Erwin. Little girl, what do you want to ask? Freya pulled out her sword and pointed it at Queen Madara. The 2 black knights were shocked. They wanted to rush forward with their swords, but Queen Madara reached out to stop them. She still pointed the Lionheart sword at her snow-white neck. She raised her head and looked at Brando on the balcony, but Brando's expression did not change. He put one hand on the hilt of Oderfeis and only looked at the Black Knight behind her coldly. Queen Madara believed that if the 2 black knights behind her dared to pull out their swords, they would be reduced to ashes in the next moment. Queen Madara ignored the sharp edge of the sword and looked directly at Freya. What do you want, little girl? Freya did not say a word, but she suddenly sheathed the Lionheart sword and put it back into its scabbard. Queen Madara seemed to understand something. She snorted coldly and said, I see. It seems that you mean I am the culprit behind all of this? Your Majesty! The 2 black knights shouted in unison. But Queen Madara only waved her hand at them. She raised her head and said to Freya, Yes, I am the instigator of the War of the Black Roses. The blood feud of Butchie should be counted on me. I will not repent for it. Freya looked at the Queen coldly. Queen Madara looked back at her fearlessly. I welcome you to put your sword in my chest at any time if you can do it. Of course you too, Mr. Count. The same goes for you. Her tone was arrogant as if she was still on her throne, and her tone was full of contempt for death. Queen Madara was standing in the hall, but she seemed to be looking down at everyone present, even Brando who was standing on the balcony. However, in this war I need you to stand with me. Madara, Erwin, and the 4 holy cathedrals. I need you to help me persuade the descendants of the 4 sages. I will kill you. Freya's eyes were full of hatred. You will pay for everything you have done. But Erwin and Madara will also stand together, Brando said softly, as if he was stating an established fact. His voice echoed in the hall like the ravings of a ghost. We will do our best to persuade the 4 holy cathedrals to face this war that belongs to the whole of Wonde. Freya turned around and nodded silently. The Queen chuckled. She also turned her back to everyone, waved her hand, and did not say another word. She walked out of the hall with the two black knights. In the darkness, only the sound of footsteps could be heard. Chapter 1342. Does your Royal Highness have anything to say to me? Brando asked after Queen Madara left. Yes, there are 2 letters in total. One is from His Highness Haruz, and the other is from His Royal Highness. He entrusted Her Royal Highness to pass them to you. His Royal Highness? Brando thought for a moment, thinking that the Royal Highness should have made some moves in the north, unless he really didn't covet Erwin's throne at all. But judging from the way he arranged for his sister Kiara to be part of the envoy group, he was not an unambitious person. To be honest, he admired the first-in-line heir of House Cypher. Although he was born with a disability, he was wise, calm, patient, and knew when to advance and retreat. If House Cypher was orthodox, Brando even thought that the Royal Highness would be more suitable to inherit Erwin's throne because he was a man. After all, Erwin had no precedent of a female monarch, and Haruz's personality was too weak. Unfortunately, House Cypher lost its legitimate status in Erwin, since it was abandoned by the Lionheart sword. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but glance at the Lionheart sword in Freya's hand. Is the letter here? It's on me. Freya opened her purse and took out 2 well-preserved letters. She stacked the 2 letters together and handed them over with both hands. Brando walked down the stairs and took the letter. As he was about to open it, Delphian's voice asked from behind him, "Do you need me to leave?" Brando looked back at her, thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, stay. If you stay, I might need your advice." He didn't intend to fully trust this woman, but although his alliance with Her Royal Highness and Haruz was not yet on the table, it was nothing compared to the other secrets they had experienced along the way. Delphian? It was only then that Freya noticed the Prime Minister's daughter on the balcony. She couldn't help but look surprised. "You are? Your lord saved my life. As repayment, I will serve Abes wholeheartedly." Delphian replied with a smile. "Brando, what's going on?" Freya raised her heroic eyebrows and spoke in an unfriendly tone. She placed one hand on the hilt of the Lionheart sword, as if she would unsheath the sword at the slightest provocation. The Shire and Amandina had told her everything that happened in Rushta. She also knew how the Roman was captured by the tree herders, and how the Twilight Dragon descended. It could be said that the Silver Queen and the tree herders were responsible for 1/3 of the disaster that happened that day, and the remaining 1/3 was this woman's responsibility. Freya and the Roman knew each other since childhood and grew up together in Bucci. It could be said that they were closer to each other than Brando. As the person who hurt the Roman, she didn't immediately draw her sword out of respect for Brando. Brando looked coldly at Delphian. This woman was playing her tricks again. Others might not understand, but he couldn't be any clearer. She was purposely angering Freya. He used his eyes to warn Freya not to cause any more trouble, and told her everything that had happened from Rushta to the Sea of Elements to Rosaline. He also told her about his current relationship with the Prime Minister's daughter, and the mystery of the Nature's Orb's whereabouts to the Valkyrie from Bucci. Freya listened to Brando's description and her expression softened. She didn't expect Brando to have experienced so much alone. She couldn't help but ask, "I didn't expect you to have experienced so much. Are you all right, Brando?" Brando shook his head. Freya thought for a moment. She wasn't the naive girl from before, so she quickly found a suspicious point. "But Brando, when you wanted to kill her on the ship, why didn't you do it in the end? Did she tell you the secret of the jade of her own accord?" Brando suddenly blushed as he recalled that ridiculous night. He quickly coughed and said vaguely, "Well, probably." Delphian looked at his awkward expression and snickered on the balcony. "Probably? Well." Brando could only change the topic. "Let's take a look at the letter first. I thought it would be the princess who wrote to me. I didn't expect it to be Haruz. What did the prince say in the letter?" Freya shook her head honestly. "I don't know either. This is a letter personally written to you by His Highness. How could I peek at it?" "That's right." Freya didn't know what Freya was thinking. She didn't know what Freya was thinking. Brando opened the envelope and shook out the letter from it. Haruz's envelope was sealed with his royal seal with the emblem of stars, moon, and lilies on it. It was the emblem of the royal family of Erwin, but as the heir of the kingdom, His private emblem was slightly different from that of graphene, with more ivy patterns. He opened the letter and glanced at it. There were only a few lines on the first page of the letter. The young prince first greeted him as a student, then briefly described the process of his return to Erewhon, the progress of learning black magic, and so on. The respectful wording and tone of the letter made him smile. Once again, he thought of his shy and introverted student. What did Prince Haruz write in the letter? Freya asked curiously when she saw the smile on Brando's face. Obviously, this polite and shy young prince was also very popular in the Abbey's territory. It's nothing. He's just sending his regards. In the letter, he mentioned that Lady Freya is an excellent and noble knight, unlike his teacher. I'm sure you'll only know the contents of the letter after I open it. What does that mean? It means you won't peek. He asked me to say hello to you on his behalf. Brando, what did you teach Prince Haruz? How are you going to explain it to Her Royal Highness? Freya replied grumpily. Isn't that good? Only boys with a sense of humor can win the favor of women. Brando said as he opened the second page of the letter and continued reading. Oh, is that so? Freya deliberately glanced at Delphian, who was standing on the balcony. Although she couldn't get angry at Brando, it didn't mean she was an idiot. Brando immediately coughed loudly. I will tell the Roman. She held the sword, blushed, and gritted her teeth. Brando. The Prime Minister's daughter smiled but didn't say anything. But at this time, Brando raised his eyebrows and made a soft sound of surprise. He suddenly closed the letter with a very strange expression on his face. Freya noticed Brando's expression and stopped joking. She asked seriously, What's wrong? Haruz said he doesn't want to inherit Erewhon's throne. What? What? One after the other, Freya and Delphian on the balcony opened their mouths at the same time. However, the former's voice was pure surprise, while the Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have heard a strange story. Just like how a simple-minded person like a blank sheet of paper couldn't understand the ambitions of others. Ambitious people often found it difficult to understand Haruz's desire to pursue freedom and plain life. In Delphian's mind, there was actually someone in this world who wasn't passionate about power and status. Then this person must be a fool. But Brando could barely understand the thoughts of his shy student. They were actually the same kind of people. If they weren't bound by responsibility, profit, power, and ambition weren't what they pursued. Haruz worked hard to become mature step by step, just to fulfill the expectations of Princess Graphene. And when he understood the responsibility he shouldered, perhaps the bond between the king and his subjects would be added. However, these were not what the young prince wanted. He was a little lost in thought, and then said to the others present, Haruz said in the letter that he is not the person Erewhon needs. Erewhon needs a real hero, but that hero is not him. How can he be so willful? Freya was so surprised that she almost couldn't close her mouth. What about Her Royal Highness? Her Royal Highness didn't object. As the King of Erewhon, he has the right to pass the crown to the successor he entrusted, as long as this person has enough qualifications. Delphian suddenly said. For example, the successor of the royal blood or a prince. A prince? Delphian looked at Brando. If the seigneur marries Princess Graphene, he can be that prince. In Erewhon, no one is more qualified than him for this position. Freya opened her mouth in surprise and looked at Brando in disbelief. Indeed, Brando nodded. This is also one of Haruz's ideas. The other candidate is His Royal Highness, the eldest son of the king. If Haruz abdicates himself, House Cypher will have a legal position. But he looked at Freya and Delphian and changed the topic. We are not suitable. Freya had not yet reacted to this shocking news. Only Delphian asked in confusion. Why? Isn't this a good opportunity for us? My lord, if you want to save Erewhon, you have to have it first. And as long as the Count becomes the master of Erewhon, you can use its power. And it will help us rescue the Roman lady, isn't it? Brando glanced at her as if he could see straight into her heart, but he shook his head and did not say anything. He just opened the second letter, the one sent to him by the eldest son of the king. To his surprise, this letter was in 2 copies, one of which was sent to him by Princess Chiara. Although he had always been biased against the northern nobles, he had always had a good impression of this little princess. After all, although Princess Chiara was a little capricious, she had saved his life. Without giving any promises at all, she had given him Cypher's heart, which was extremely important to the Cypher royal family. This kindness alone was not something he could ignore. However, Princess Chiara's letter did not mention anything about Cypher's heart. She only chatted with him about a bunch of interesting things she had encountered these days, and then told him that she could live in Abyss for a while as a magic apprentice. Coincidentally, her teacher was Amandina, who was recommended by Garlock. Of course, in Brando's view, this was not a coincidence at all. It must be the arrangement of the eldest son of the king. He could not help but shake his head, unable to figure out what the eldest son of the king was planning. Then he began to read the second letter. When he opened the letter sent to him by the eldest son of the king, Brando could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly, looking very surprised. In the letter, the eldest son of the king talked with him about the situation in the north of Erewhon. Overall, it was not too bad, but it was not too good either. Since the disaster of the fallen moon, a large number of refugees from Cruz had poured into the north of Erewhon through Anzaruta. Due to the abnormal weather after the arrival of the magic tide, the crops in the north of Erewhon failed, resulting in a large-scale famine. On the other hand, although the nobles in the north were bound by him to stand on the side of the Corvado royal family in the War of the Black Rose, with the end of the war and the onset of famine, the nobles in the north began to be less respectful than before the war. The nobles in the Grey Mountain and Balta had even threatened to take back Ampere Seal, so that they could survive the unbearable winter with the wealth of Ampere Seal. The eldest son of the king also mentioned in the letter that he and the princess should be careful of the royal faction, because according to the information sent back by his subordinates, some of the royal faction might be in contact with the nobles in the north. Although Brando was a little surprised that the eldest son of the king would remind him and the princess, what really surprised him was not this, but the last paragraph of the letter written by the eldest son of the king. Count Henry, thank you for fighting for the fate of Erewhon. You and I both know what the fate of this kingdom is. The dispute between Cypher and the Corvado royal family has been going on for 100 years, and now it seems that it has reached the final moment. It is like a carriage that is driving into the abyss. I and you in the south each hold the reins of the carriage. For a long time we have carefully restrained this carriage so that it will not fall into the abyss of no return. But today, the moment the two families decide the winner, the north and the south will completely go in opposite directions. His Royal Highness is kind, but he does not see the blood and fire that this kingdom will face in the future. I believe that you must understand this. What Erewhon needs is not you and me, but a king who can bear the past grievances and history of the two families. And this lady is right beside you. I believe that with your sharp eyes, you must have already known her name. Your esteemed friend, Levin Orneson Cypher. Brando held the page in his hand and was in a daze for a long time. His heart was like a stormy sea, and for the first time, he admired the first successor of the Cypher family. Perhaps in history, if he and not Queen Anna had stepped on the stage of history, Erewhon's history might have been different. Oh! Chapter 1343. The person mentioned in Levin's letter, Brando might have been puzzled before the trip to the elemental frontier, but now he knew very well that it was Amandina, the descendant of Baitiamaz's husband and the two children left behind by his ex-wife. She had the blood of the Cypher royal family, and at the same time stood firmly on the side of the traditional southern forces in Abyss, Ampere Seal, the dispute between the princess and the royal faction, and the subsequent Second War of the Black Roses. It could be said that she had the reputation of having both sides. Levin's letter said that she was a king who could carry the past grievances and history of the two families. Although Erewhon did not have the precedent of a queen, at this point, everyone could understand in their hearts that it was time for the ancient kingdom of Erewhon to change its traditions. Haruz was very good, but he was not suitable to be a king. Griffin and Levin each represented the forces of the south and north. As for Brando himself, first of all, he was not in the right position. He assisted Her Royal Highness Princess Griffin in governing Erewhon, and his identity was a glorious knight loyal to the orthodox bloodline of Corvado. It was because of this that he was able to gain the favor of the Highland Knight, Lantanilan, and Duke Vero. But if he took over the crown of Awin according to Haruz's wishes, then he would be a despicable usurper, and his reputation and honor would disappear. Even the original alliance in the south would fall apart because of this. Perhaps Brando could care less about his reputation and honor, but he did not want to see the south return to the state before the Battle of Ampere Seal, which could be said to be a disaster for this ancient kingdom. Haruz was simple-minded and only considered the good side of things. Brando believed that the abdication mentioned in his letter was absolutely from his sincere thoughts. But Brando also knew that people's hearts were complicated, and the nobles would never look at this issue so simply. In fact, the rise of a powerful minister alone made the traditional noble forces uneasy. A series of actions by the royal faction, starting from his diplomatic mission to Cruz, showed that the nobles of Radnor and Grafine were trying to marginalize him and weaken his trust in Princess Grafine. Therefore, they would not tolerate him ascending the throne as a prince. As for Her Royal Highness, she might be more far-sighted than her brother, but she was also faced with a difficult choice. Should she choose to believe in Brendel? Should she choose to believe in someone who had even surpassed Duke Arek's power since the time of Arek? This was not an empty threat. Brando was the Lord of Tanajil, but in fact, he controlled Radnor, Vlada Paz, and most of the hilly areas in the south of Arek. He occupied almost 1/6 of Erewhon's land, and at the same time, held the most powerful military force in this ancient kingdom. To put it simply, if Brando and his forces chose to stand by and watch in the Second War of the Black Rose, then Erewhon would face even more desperate than in history. It was for this reason that Princess Grafine firmly stood on the side of the forces represented by Brando and Valhalla. Therefore, although Grafine knew the consequences of Haruz's choice, she still decisively supported her brother. On one hand, it was because Haruz was not suitable to be the king of Erewhon, and on the other hand, she handed the choice to him, wanting to see his true colors. Brando seemed to suddenly think of something. He suddenly folded Levin Ornestein-Cypher's letter, opened Haruz's letter, and turned directly to the last page. As expected, he found a silver lily ornament in the lower left corner. This ornament was exactly the same as the pattern on the brooch she gave him that day. It was the personal coat of arms belonging to Her Royal Highness. At the same time, it could also prove the authenticity of this letter. If Brando took this letter to Erewhon's noble parliament, even if he could not win the support of the majority in the end, the Corvado royal family would lose its legitimacy because of this letter. Brando held these two letters and for a moment, he felt as if they weighed 1,000 pounds. These were two heavy trusts, one from the eldest son of the king in the north, and the other from Her Royal Highness the Princess. In the end, Princess Grafine handed the fate of the kingdom, her and her brother's fate, without reservation in his hands. Erewhon's future might depend on his next idea. There was no doubt that the eldest son of the king in the north also deeply understood this, so he declined an opportunity in his letter. That might be the closest House Cypher had been to Erewhon's throne since they lost the favor of the Lionheart sword. But for Erewhon's future, he passed this letter to Brando through the hands of Her Royal Highness the Princess and Freya. Brando had never understood the eldest son of the king. There were very few descriptions of him in history. He only knew that this was a wise and ambitious man. He had lofty ideals and aspirations. Because of this, Brando had been carefully guarding against all the actions of the eldest son of the king for a long time. But today, Brendel suddenly understood why he had such a dream, and what his ambition was. "Do you see, Her Royal Highness, Senior and everyone?" Brando took a deep breath and suddenly felt a little dry in his eyes. "We are not fighting alone. In places where we can't see, there are many people standing side by side with us." He looked up, and in front of him was not the gloomy hall, but the hills of Tanajil, the rivers and plains of Ampere Seal. He saw shining flags and raised swords. The knights swore in unison. "May the black pine be evergreen, may Erewhon live forever. May the ideals shine as before, may the swords shine as before." The fire of civilization was passed down in the dark wilderness, and Brando seemed to have received one of the torches. Under the trusting gaze of the two who held the torch was handed to him. He silently put away the two letters, and at that moment, he had made a decision in his heart. "Freya," he said. "What's wrong, Brando?" Freya did not quite understand why Brando suddenly became serious halfway through the letter. Could it be that there was some bad news in the letter? His Royal Highness is planning to make a move on the south? She thought about it in her heart. "Do you know why I asked you to come here?" Freya shook her head. There are two main reasons, Brando replied. The first is about the inheritance of your Valkyrie's mark. I know a lady who has a similar power to yours. She may know the origin of your power and teach you how to use it in battle. But about this, Miss Andrea will tell you about it in private later, so I won't go into detail here to avoid wasting time. Miss Andrea is? Brando turned his head and looked in the direction of the balcony. Andrea, who was standing next to Delphian, quickly waved her hand. In fact, Freya had already noticed this girl and quickly nodded to her. What's the second reason? Freya turned her head and asked. The second reason is the main reason why I asked you to come here. Freya's expression turned solemn when she heard this. The war between Erwin and Madara has come to an end, but it is not because we defeated the undead, but because the undead are facing another war with us. Brando told her about the war between Madara and the Crystal Cluster, the threat of the Dusk to Wound, and the plan of the Queen of Madara. Freya listened carefully to his statement and showed a thoughtful expression. Then she frowned and replied, Speaking of which, those monsters, I have heard similar rumors in Erwin. What? Brando was shocked. The claws of the Dusk Dragon had already appeared in Erwin? Freya thought for a moment and replied, It has something to do with the people of Cruz. Since the disaster of the fallen moon, many refugees from Anzaruta have poured into the kingdom from the northern border. Some of the refugees mentioned the war in the north, and there were similar monsters in their words. The war in the north of Cruz. Brando finally understood. He remembered the words of the Queen of Madara and asked, Are there any details about that war? No, it is said that the war took place in the north of the Sublime Inland Sea. Most of the refugees from Cruz and Erwin are from Anzaruta. There are only some one-sided rumors about that war. Freya shook her head and replied, Do you still remember Breton? The White Lion Legion took in many refugees in the north. I also heard these things from them. Brando remembered this name. 2 years ago, Breton had caused trouble for him in Bucci. It was as if in the blink of an eye, there was a layer of estrangement between him and the past. Everything about the garrison seemed to have happened a long time ago. He asked about Captain Martin's situation. After learning that he had returned to Bucci and was still the captain of the garrison, he could not help but smile. Freya continued to talk about the war in the north. Overall, the situation did not seem too good. The Wind Elves had crossed the Golden Forest and approached the north of Erwin, as if they were guarding against something. But because the kingdom had just experienced a war, Her Highness had not had time to send out envoys. Brando thought of something and replied, Well, at least the Wind Elves are nervous. Maybe this will make our plan easier. But Brando, Freya was not so optimistic. Regarding the alliance between Erwin and Madara, the opinions in the kingdom are not as unified as you think. Do you still remember the question I asked you before? In Manowar, Karsuk, Viro and Grinwars, these war-torn regions, there are many who have the same opinion. The royal faction has used this opportunity to attack you in front of Her Highness more than once. They will not be happy to see your influence in the kingdom grow. Brendel sneered. He had already expected this. They're nothing but clowns. These short-sighted fools are nothing more than scabs. Then Brando. Freya saw that he was confident and did not try to dissuade him. In her mind there was nothing that Brando could not do. Ever since they had fought their way out of the encirclement of Fortress Reden, she had no doubts about this. What message do you want me to bring back to Her Highness? Oh,